Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. One day away from the Trump-Putin summit. Very dangerous times awaits ahead. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution? Like, share, subscribe, support the platform. Y'all salute family. Well, it's very dangerous times later ahead of us. Who knows? I don't think the Zionists want this meeting. I know Zelensky don't want this meeting. The Europeans don't want this meeting. A lot of people in America don't want this meeting. Is Putin life in danger? Let's get into the content. I don't trust the snakes.
A few hours ago, it became known that US President Donald Trump had a video conference with the so-called European leaders and the head of the Kiev regime, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is currently on an official visit to the German capital, Berlin. According to insiders, during this video conference, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, along with other European leaders, attempted to persuade Donald Trump to refrain from using the term territory exchange in the future. According to them, this term was relevant when the Ukrainian army controlled part of the Kursk region. However, now that the Ukrainian army has fled the Kursk region, there can be no exchange of territories with Russia. At the same time, the so-called European leaders once again reminded Donald Trump that the Ukrainian constitution does not allow Kiev to give up its territories and transfer them to outside states. By the way, during a video conversation with the US president, the head of the Kiev regime, Volodymyr Zelensky, fully confirmed these statements. At the same time, it is worth noting that this political clown still continues to tell Ukrainian citizens that the fighting in the Kursk region is still ongoing, and that the Ukrainian army units are still present on the territory of this Russian region. Thus, it becomes clear that the so-called guarantor of the Ukrainian constitution sees nothing wrong with consistently deceiving his electorate. By the way, Mr. Zelensky, who calls himself the president of Ukraine, once again stated to Western journalists that the Ukrainian army would never leave the territory of Donbass. Zelensky reiterated that no agreements between the United States and Russia could force him to order the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass and other regions, as the country's constitution does not allow him to do so. In addition, this political clown in all seriousness said that Ukraine has prepared a number of requirements that Russia must fulfill in order to achieve peace. In particular, Zelensky demanded that Russia not only withdraw its troops from Donbass and other regions of the country, but also pay reparations to Kiev, totaling at least $500 billion. It is worth noting that after that, even pro-government Ukrainian experts and analysts began to doubt Zelensky's adequacy. According to their perspective, Zelensky's demands amid the current realities on the battlefield are indicative of delusions common to individuals experiencing severe mental illness. It is also worth noting a rather provocative statement by Polish Deputy Defense Minister, Cezary Tomczak. In particular, speaking with Polish journalists from the Polsat news channel, this senior Polish official stated that if Ukraine were to surrender, it would also be a defeat for Poland. In this regard, he stressed that the Poles should do everything possible to ensure that Kiev does not sign an act of humiliating capitulation. If Ukraine is humiliated and capitulates to Russia, it will be primarily a colossal defeat for Poland, and President Karol Nawrocki, Polish Deputy Defense Minister Cezary Tomczak said. According to him, the current president of Poland has excellent relations with the Trump administration, and that this fact may prevent Russia from winning in Ukraine. At the same time, it is worth noting that the current president of Poland, Karol Nawrocki, is on the Kremlin's blacklist. The fact is that in February 2024, Russia issued an arrest warrant for him, due to the destruction and damage of monuments to soldiers of the Red Army in Poland. In this regard, many experts do not understand how, after the end of the current conflict, Poland will build relations with such a superpower as Russia, headed by a government of an ardent Russophobe and nationalist like Karol Nawrocki. Meanwhile, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation has officially announced that in anticipation of the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska, NATO countries are preparing sabotage acts and provocations against Russia. Indeed, over the past 72 hours, the activity of NATO intelligence in the Black Sea, off the coast of Crimea, and the Krasnodar region, has increased dramatically. In particular, the Russian military began to record the activity of G550, E3, and E-7T long-range radar detection aircraft. In addition, starting on August 11, Russian radars and means of detection began to record excessive activity of such reconnaissance aircraft as RC-135W and RC-135V, belonging to the Royal Air Force of Britain. It is reported that the flight route of these enemy aircraft indicates that NATO shows interest in the western part of Crimea and the southwestern part of the Krasnodar region. Furthermore, sources in the Russian Defense Ministry acknowledged that the excessive activity of enemy reconnaissance aircraft near Russia's southwestern borders indicates that NATO is really preparing attacks and sabotage acts in anticipation of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Alaska. Meanwhile, on the morning of August 14, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation officially announced a missile strike on a classified enemy military training ground in the settlement of Desna, Chernihiv region. Reports indicate that on the night of August 14, an Iskander-M ballistic missile accurately hit its target, killing dozens of Ukrainian militants and so-called foreign mercenaries. Moreover, sources in the Russian military department confirmed that an Iskander-M ballistic missile also destroyed an elite group of Ukrainian and British saboteurs, who were planning attacks on the territory of the Crimean Peninsula and Krasnodar region. It is reliably known that as a result of this missile attack, one HIMARS system, 70 Ukrainian militants, and about 30 so-called foreign mercenaries were destroyed. It is reported that all of them were British citizens.
Liberal press
I'm going to Russia
I will go to Russia on Friday.
on Friday.
The first information has appeared about who will accompany Putin to Alaska. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed that Minister Lavrov will take part in the negotiations. There is still no information about the composition of the U.S. delegation. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Fedyev today commented on the numerous speculations about the so-called exchange of territories. Quote, "The territorial structure of Russia is enshrined in the constitution of our country. That is, Russia will not withdraw troops from the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, although there were rumors about the withdrawal of troops in a number of Western media outlets." Donald Trump lashed out at the liberal press ahead of the meeting with Putin. According to him, unscrupulous, corrupt journalists as he said, and dishonest people will scold him, even if he gets Leningrad and Moscow for free as part of the deal. It was Leningrad that the US president called St. Petersburg on his social network Truth Social. And a striking example of inadequacy appeared on the front page of The Guardian. Allegedly, Putin will manipulate Trump, pulling all sorts of strings. To avoid this, Trump must continue the war and destroy the Russian economy. Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, responds that it is an honor for the American president to receive Putin in the United States. On Friday morning, President Trump will travel to Anchorage, Alaska, to hold a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. From Moscow to Anchorage is 6,900 kilometers. From Washington to Anchorage is 5,400 kilometers. That is, Trump will completely cross the United States, and Putin will cross all of Russia. The negotiations will take place at the U.S. military base Elmendorf-Richardson.
Summer is the peak tourist season in Alaska, and therefore there were very few suitable and accessible venues to host the two world leaders. The organizers soon came to the conclusion that the only city in the huge state with real possibilities for the summit was Anchorage. And only the Elmendorf-Richardson joint base in the north of the city met the security requirements for such a historic meeting. Although the White House hoped to avoid the impression that the Russian leader and his delegation were on an American military base, the extremely unscrupulous media took on my meeting with Putin. They constantly quote fired losers and very stupid people like John Bolton, who just said that despite the fact that the meeting is taking place on American soil, Putin has already won. The only place that would suit Putin even more than Alaska is if the summit were held in Moscow. So, in my opinion, from the start, this is already a big victory for Putin. What is this anyway? We win everywhere. The lying newsmakers work overtime, because overtime is not taxed. If I got Moscow and Leningrad in a deal with Russia, the fake news would say I made a bad deal. You have to understand that for President Trump, this meeting is not a concession. If you watch some news, although I don't watch it much anymore, you can see how people are simply going crazy. Oh, this is a victory for Putin. He got a meeting, but he himself does not perceive it that way. A meeting is a way to understand the situation and make a decision. I want to know all the facts. I want to look this person in the eye, and this is exactly what the president wants.
U.S. President George Walker Bush was the first to talk about Putin's eyes, into which he looked and saw the soul in them, back in 2001. 6 years later, Putin came to visit him at his ranch and stayed there overnight. After that, there was a return visit, and the famous Russian song and dance Barinya in Sochi.
I looked into his eyes and saw that he was a very straightforward and honest person. We had a very good dialogue, and I can sense of his soul. Judging by today's dialogue, I have the impression that we can have a constructive development of the situation in this direction. In any case, the president is listening carefully, and he hears our arguments.
The current summit in the State Department is called an introductory one. The president does not call it a meeting for negotiations. It was not he who initiated the meeting. As I said earlier, the goal is to understand what is happening and to assess what may be possible. Therefore, the word negotiations is hardly appropriate here. According to The Economist magazine, Trump is preparing an ultimatum for Europe and Ukraine. Either concessions with a new security architecture in the European Union, or life without American satellites, weapons and intelligence.
Why not invite Zelensky to this summit? Whose decision is it not to invite him? Was it the decision of the US president or President Putin?
This meeting will take place because the Russian president, through Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, asked the US president for a meeting, and I think that for the President of the United States to meet face-to-face with the President of Russia in the same room, rather than on the phone, will give Trump the best understanding of how to end this war and where this is going. Part of the meeting will be held face-to-face, without the participation of delegations.
Yesterday, the president said twice that he plans to visit Russia.
I'm going to Russia.
I will go to Russia on Friday. Was that a slip of the tongue, or is he really planning to go to Russia?
There may be plans to go to Russia in the future. CNN calls Zelensky the main obstacle to peace. He has made over 110 trips during the war. He has visited about 40 different countries, 5 times more than Joe Biden has visited in his entire presidency. He has been to Germany 11 times, France 10 times, he has flown across the Atlantic to the United States 9 times, but he still has not been able to negotiate peace. Important news, the Russian Defense Ministry reports that a provocation is being prepared ahead of the Alaska summit. This information was received through several communication channels. On Monday, the Security Service of Ukraine brought foreign journalists to the city of Chugov in the Kharkiv region to prepare, as was stated, reports on life in frontline cities. Kiev, however, wants to see materials about the attack on a densely populated residential area in the Kharkiv region. The Ukrainians themselves will shell it in order to blame Russia for this terrorist attack through Western propagandists and cause a wave of sympathy for Ukraine in the world. Well, that is, Kiev decided to arrange a new Bucha. It was there, with the help of a bloody provocation near Kiev, that the Zelensky regime sabotaged the negotiations in Istanbul in 2022. Now they want to disrupt the summit in Alaska and prevent Putin from meeting with Trump.
According to available information received through several channels, the Kiev regime is preparing a provocation in order to disrupt the Russian-American negotiations scheduled for August 15th of this year. For this purpose, a group of foreign media journalists were delivered to the city of Chugov in the Kharkiv region on Monday, August 11th, by Ukrainian intelligence vehicles under the guise of preparing a series of reports about the residents of the city in the frontline zone. Immediately before the summit on Friday, Ukraine planned a provocative strike using drones and missiles on one of the densely populated residential areas or hospitals with a large number of casualties among the civilian population, which should be immediately recorded by imported Western journalists. As a result of this provocation by the Kiev regime, all responsibility for the strike and civilian casualties will be placed on the armed forces of the Russian Federation in order to create a negative media background and conditions for the disruption of Russian-American cooperation on the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Provocations are also possible in other settlements controlled by the Kiev regime.
The White House calls on Ukraine to be pragmatic. According to Politico, on the eve of the summit, Washington asks Kiev to realistically and adequately assess the situation on the front, bearing in mind the military power of the enemy. There is only one day left until the meeting between Putin and Trump. We continue with the most important news about the breakthrough of the Russian army to Dobropoli. The first official confirmations from the Ministry of Defense have appeared. The military department reports the liberation of 2 settlements, Nikanorovka and Suvorova, which the Kiev regime renamed Zaydashok. The offensive northeast of Krasnoarmysk continues. It is reported that Russian fighters have consolidated their positions in Sahetskoye, and on the eastern outskirts of Rodinskoye, fighting is underway for Zolotoy Kolodets. According to some reports, this village is already under our control. It is reported that Russia's advanced assault groups are already in Anovka, which adjoins Dobropoli from the north, the most important logistics hub of the Ukrainian army. The situation is covered in the fog of war. Small groups of our fighters are penetrating even deep into the rear, sowing chaos and panic in the ranks of enemy fighters. The disoriented Ukrainian formations no longer have a defense system. Simultaneously with the breakthrough to Dobropoli, the pincers are closing to the north of Krasnoarmysk, which is already surrounded on 3 other sides. The local Gauleiter reports that the last store in the city has closed, and it is practically impossible to enter or leave. The Ukrainian army group will very soon find itself in a cauldron. The depth of the wedging by this minute is estimated at 18 kilometers.
Dear friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel and like it. Thank you.
The video shows how powerful blows hit positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, completely destroying the defenses and wiping out Kiev's troops, in the settlement of Andriivka Klevtsov, also known as Iskra. Iskra, located south of Donetsk, is a large Ukrainian defense hub with over 700 heavily fortified buildings, and is another gateway to the Dnipropetrovsk region. But Russian units of the Vostok Group, pressing with a fierce attack and reliable fire support, managed to break through, and then complete its liberation, as confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense on August 14, 2025. Vostok Group doesn't talk, continued to advance throughout the battle, destroying enemy firing positions, command posts, and the combat equipment of Zelensky's stubborn and NATO-fueled forces. Those trying to prevent the loss of the settlement should realize that if such attacks continue for the next 2 months, it will lead to the complete annihilation of Ukrainian forces. As a result of decisive and skillful actions, the settlement of Iskra fell under the control of the Vostok Group of the 36th Guards Brigade of the 29th Army, after days of fighting that were responsible for its capture. Soldiers of the 36th Guards Brigade raised the Russian flag over the settlement, although victory was not a slogan here, but a daily reality on the ground. As a result of the battle for Iskra, they managed to control an area of over 25 square kilometers. Ukraine suffered heavy losses, losing up to an entire battalion in manpower and equipment. Now, the front line is moving west. Only 2 Ukrainian-held settlements remain in the southern part of Donetsk, but it seems the Russian armed forces won't be letting up anytime soon.
Today is Thursday, August 14th, 2025. We are still in the lead up to this meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump. It is being held in Alaska. There are reports that it will take place on a US military base. And I want to make it abundantly clear about not only what this meeting is about, but what US policy objectives actually are, and the role Europe plays in implementing, not opposing, implementing these policy objectives, and how a perceived US-European split is absolutely necessary to sell to the European people this policy that the US has publicly, openly, and repeatedly demanded Europe carry out on their behalf. And so where we are going to begin is again here, February 12th, 2025, opening remarks by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at Ukraine Defense Contact Group. When people listened to Secretary Hegseth read out these remarks, or as they go through the points in this statement, they like to just pick out what they want to hear and completely ignore everything else. I have printed it out. I have read this over and over again, probably over 100 times since February, and I'm going to read it again. I'm going to pick out the key points that everyone, for whatever reason, and I don't think that it's dishonesty. I just think it is an aversion to accepting reality. The fact that continuity of agenda persists, that the Trump administration is fully committed to it, just as it was during its first term in office, and that this conflict is going to continue. And what the United States is after is not peace, not divestment from Ukraine, but a Minsk III framework where they can freeze the conflict, pivot to China, a much more dangerous and costly conflict, before circling around back and dealing with Russia later. Strategic sequencing, which is what all of US policy papers, including policy papers written by people now in the Trump administration, have laid out, have said the objective and the agenda actually all is. So we heard about Secretary Hegseth saying the bloodshed must stop and this war must end. Stopping the fighting and reaching an enduring peace is a top priority. He's telling you what you want to hear. But then the details of how that is going to happen completely contradict these sentiments. He talks about how a durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. Nowhere in this statement, nowhere among these remarks by Secretary Hegseth is any discussion about why this conflict began in the first place, that it was the US overthrowing the elected government of Ukraine and transforming Ukraine into a national security risk right on Russia's border from 2014 onward, including bringing in NATO forces, again, right on Russia's border, the CIA taking over Ukraine's intelligence agencies. This was admitted by the New York Times in 2024, the spy war, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin. For more than a decade, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. Everything we see Ukrainian intelligence do is a product of the CIA having captured Ukraine's intelligence apparatus and using it to pursue US interests at the expense of Ukraine itself. When we hear about secret SBU plans to disrupt the upcoming meeting between President Putin and President Trump, that is the US CIA doing that. And it's not because there's some sort of split between the Trump administration and the CIA, but it is because that is exactly what US foreign policy, as described by Secretary Hegseth himself, said needed to be done. There needs to be the perception of some sort of division between Europe and the United States so that European governments, people who actually work for US interests at the expense of the European people's best interests, they need to be able to sell to the European people why they are going to pick up and continue this war. If they told the truth and said, the United States wants hegemony over all of Eurasia, including the European continent, including all of our nations, but they just don't have the resources enough to do it at this moment. To do this here in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and also pursue containment of China, they need us to take our resources to override our own best interests and pick up where they left off. European people would say, no, that is absurd. We are not going to do that. So what they're doing instead is pretending as if the United States is abandoning them. They have created this myth that Russia somehow poses an existential threat to all of Europe. And they said that as the US betrays Europe and divests from this war that the US itself started, we have to pick up the slack. We need to pick up and continue this conflict, or all of Europe will disappear, just as they claim Russia intends to do to Ukraine. That is the gambit that is being played here. Let's get back to February 12, 2025, Secretary Hegseth says any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. He's talking about NATO troops going into Ukraine, and not to end the conflict, not to address the core issue that started it in the first place, but to freeze it, to send in Western forces and to create a tripwire that Russia dares not trigger. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. And this is to absolve the United States of any perceived commitment to swoop in and save them if Russia decides to continue fighting anyway, regardless of their presence in Ukraine. There must also be a robust international oversight of the line of contact. So again, they're not talking about ending the conflict. They're talking about freezing it and monitoring the line of contact. He says this must not be Minsk 3.0, but that is literally what he is describing, Minsk 3.0. Then he talks about compelling Russia to agree to the ceasefire, because that's what the United States is trying to do right now. Force Russia into agreeing to the ceasefire so those European troops can be sent into Ukraine and permanently freeze the conflict until they're ready to start it again on their own terms, just like they did to Syria. And he talks about driving down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. He also says Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. A lot of people heard Vice President J.D. Vance in Europe recently saying the U.S. is going to no longer continue investing in this war. They're not sending U.S. tax dollars to this war anymore. He didn't say they're going to end the war. He even literally said that the U.S. will still send weapons, but it'll be Europe that pays for them. Secretary Hegseth continues. He says, this means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defensive industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree, and all of Europe agrees. And they have all agreed to this, and they are now incrementally working their way to go from 2% to 5% of their GDP paid into NATO and paid into continuing this war against Russia in Ukraine. So there's nothing in here about actually ending the war. The U.S. is dumping it on Europe, and Secretary Hegseth will explain exactly why they need to do this. We face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and the core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. So he's talking about the U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific on the other side of the planet from where the U.S. is actually located on a map. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity. We do not have the ability to fight Russia and China at the same time, and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. So they are prioritizing China. This is what Project 2025 spelled out. This is what the America First Policy Institute spelled out. This is what the Marathon Initiative, this is what they all spelled out when they were talking about division of labor, burden sharing, and strategic sequencing. That is the plan. They have written it down on paper. They have been talking about this for years, and they are literally implementing it step by step as described in the policy papers right now as we watch. And people are making the conscious decision to ignore all of this evidence and to indulge in wishful thinking as if President Trump just suddenly has decided to stop a century of U.S. hegemony worldwide, and he just wants peace. This is folly. This is folly, and it's going to end in the same sort of disaster and delusional deception, self-deception that we all just watched play out amid the U.S.-Iran peace talks, which ended in the U.S. bombing Iran in the middle of negotiations. Again, completely predictable because it was written down on policy papers as early as 16 years ago, and the U.S. was implementing that policy verbatim, step by step. They did exactly that, regardless of how delusional people were. Just 24 hours before President Trump bombed Iran, I had people telling me I was wrong. 16-year-old policy papers are irrelevant. The world has changed so much since then. There's no way President Trump is going to bomb Iran. And not even 24 hours later, Trump was bombing Iran. Secretary Hegseth literally uses the word division of labor. Again, this burden sharing that's been described in multiple policy papers over the last several years before the 2024 elections were even held. Together, we can establish division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and the Pacific, respectively. So he's talking about recruiting Europe into American pursuit of hegemony, having them freeze the conflict in Ukraine because the US does not have the resources. The reality of scarcity. The US will focus on China first and then come back to Russia second. That is what they are talking about. And then he goes on about how Europe is stepping up. This already began under the Biden administration, by the way. And that is the plan. That is the plan, to get Europe to take over where the US is leaving off. So the US can go pursue a much more dangerous and equally unnecessary war with China, and then come back and deal with Russia once they believe they can contain, set China back sufficiently. They will come back and deal with Russia later. There's nothing about peace with Russia anywhere in any of these papers. Not one of them. The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe, full stop. And then he continues, because it's not a full stop. But the United States will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship with this, which encourages dependency. But the entirety of NATO is an extension of US foreign policy. It is pursuing American hegemony over Eurasia. Has nothing to do with protecting Europe. Europe does not need protection from Russia. Before the United States triggered this entire conflict in the first place from 2014 onward, violently overthrowing the elected government of Ukraine in 2014, Europe and Russia were working together. Europe was benefiting from cheap hydrocarbons piped into Europe from Russia. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, and it was one that was expanding. And the United States used the overthrow of the Ukrainian government and the security crisis it created on Russia's border to derail that and to coerce Europe into cutting itself off from Russia and transforming itself into a belligerent toward Russia. And they did the exact same thing to China, because China and Europe were also working more closely together in the lead up to the US overthrow of Ukraine in 2014. That is what this is all a continuation of. There's no evidence at all whatsoever. I've not seen a single piece of evidence to suggest that somehow, somewhere, the Trump administration or anyone else representing US special interests have changed their mind regarding any of this. All they are doing is changing the narrative, changing the excuses, and attempting to implement a Minsk 3.0, just like they implemented a Minsk 1 and 2. He also talks about Europe doubling down on Ukraine. Now, again, if European leaders told the European people, the US wants hegemony over Eurasia, but they're overstretched and they want us to pick up the slack, the European people would say no. But if you can convince the European people that there's this hated American leader, Donald J. Trump, he's so terrible, him and his vice president, J.D. Vance, are bullying Europe, and we hate him so much, and he hates us so much, and he's just going to abandon us and leave us to the Russian wolves, and we have to unite, and we have to make deep, deep sacrifices to fight off these Russians who are going to invade us if we don't stop them. That's how they sell this to the European people. That is the whole purpose of all of this. There is no divide between the US and Europe. The Europeans right now, this is Reuters, this is yesterday, coalition of willing leaders set out stance on Ukraine's ceasefire pathway. And they're talking about Ukraine must have robust and credible security guarantees to effectively defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The coalition of the willing is ready to play an active role, including through plans by those willing to deploy a reassurance force once hostilities have ceased. That is literally what Secretary Hegseth told them to do back in February. That is literally what he told them to do. Security guarantees must be backed by capable European and non-European troops, but not American troops. And if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5 because the U.S. does not want to be dragged back in while it's dealing with China if the Russians decide they're not interested in this tripwire force and they're going to go right through it. This is to absolve the U.S. of having to deal with that and to force Europe to feed itself next into this proxy war the U.S. itself started for itself and solely for its own interests with Russia. That is what Europe is doing right now. That is literally what the Western media is reporting. And in order to justify all of this, They have to pretend that they're doing this because the US is betraying them, not because Secretary Hegseth literally told them to do this just a couple of months ago. And people will say, well, Brian, why do they say it publicly if it's a secret plan and they're just trying to trick people? It's public and they're still tricking everybody. I know many, many people who still completely buy into this. We remember Secretary Hegseth talking about driving down energy prices, but the point is to threaten Russia's energy revenues, what they make from energy. If they cannot drive down the prices, they will physically attack the oil infrastructure. And that is what the CIA, who controls Ukraine's intelligence agencies, and the United States military, which provides them all the targeting information, that is what they have been doing for months now. Ukraine strikes on oil facility in Western Russia, an overnight drone attack. Kiev confirms this was also just the other day. And so absolutely every aspect of this directive delivered by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, every aspect of this directive delivered in February of this year has been implemented, and they are doing it by creating this narrative that there is some sort of U.S.-European divide, even as Europe literally and verbatim takes everything Secretary Hegseth told them to do and obediently does it. That is what's going on. That is the lay of the land ahead of this summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russian President Vladimir Putin is being asked to go to Alaska so that the United States can essentially implement Minsk 3.0. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they actually do something to President Putin to endanger his security, either directly or through many, many of their proxies, where they can just simply create plausible deniability for themselves. That is the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is Minsk 3.0, and anyone who thinks that it is more optimistic than that, they are just kidding themselves. They're indulging in wishful thinking of which there is zero evidence to substantiate, and they are making the same mistake they all just made ahead of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, thinking that the U.S. was interested in peace. The evil Israelis were going to disrupt it. They're going to disrupt President Trump's peace overtures to Iran, when the U.S. spent months, if not longer, preparing the Israelis for that specific decapitation strike on Iran. And then the U.S. immediately joined in afterwards, exactly as it said in the Which Path to Persia paper published all the way back in 2009. That is how U.S. foreign policy actually works. It is driven by unelected special interests, corporations, financial institutions. They ensure that no matter who is elected and no matter who serves in Washington, they answer to them, and they are implementing their policies. Their goal, their job, their responsibility in Washington and in the corporate media is to sell these policies to you, to the Europeans, even to adversaries, to sell it to them in a way that will allow them to implement it easier. They're not going to tell you the truth, even though they do tell you the truth, but then they always dangle out this emotional narrative that they know is so much more appealing, more irresistible than just facing the truth. Right now for Russia, you would hope that almost certainly they know that this is just Minsk 3.0 being set up. They know that. They know the European troops are going into Ukraine one way or the other. We already see preparations being made for this to happen, and they will have to have a plan. They will either have to say, it's going to get frozen, and we'll have to make use of the time period that it's frozen before hostilities restart again. We'll have to make best use of that time, and better use of that time than the collective West does. Or they have to have a plan to push on regardless of the presence of European troops in Ukraine. They will have to have some sort of plan. If they honestly believe that President Trump is offering peace or is trying to remove itself from this conflict, even though their generals and their intelligence agencies are still running everything in Ukraine, if they actually believe that, then there really is no hope for Russia. Just like there kind of is no hope for Iran. Iran, I had thought at the time, knew that the negotiations were a trap and that they were prepared for, and they were just doing it to play their own game of managing public perception globally. But they had senior military and scientific leaders in public residential areas that were easily assassinated, when the US pulled the trigger on that Israeli decapitation strike. And then the US itself carried out their bombing on Iran itself. And then it kind of made me wonder, maybe they didn't know. Maybe they honestly thought they could talk their way out of this. Maybe Russia thinks they can honestly talk their way out of this. Nobody knows for sure. I don't talk to people in the Kremlin. I have no idea what they knew or didn't know about Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. If they honestly fell for that both times, maybe there's a possibility they'll fall for Minsk 3.0. And that is exactly what they are going to do. Just because Secretary Hegseth said this must not be Minsk 3.0 doesn't mean that it isn't deliberately designed to be Minsk 3.0. He said it himself in his statement in February. Nothing has changed since then. The only thing that has happened since February is Europe obediently did literally everything Secretary Hegseth told them to do, but they're selling it to the European public by pretending they have to do this because there's this big and growing split between themselves and the Americans. But again, it's all right here. So if you discount what I'm trying to say, you need to tell me why Secretary Hegseth said this in February, why you believe there's a real split between Europe and the US, but the Europeans are still literally doing everything on this list that Secretary Hegseth told them to do. And not only that, they're going to Secretary Hegseth and saying, yes, we did that. You told us to do it, and we did it.
You challenged us to step up on Ukraine, on defense spending, on European security. And I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. And last week, the British Prime Minister announced the biggest increase in defense spending since the end of the Cold War, and we will go further.
Until I can hear someone account for all of that, I remain convinced that this is Minsk 3.0. Russia is walking into a trap. Whether they're prepared for it or not, only time will tell. People will say, if President Putin goes to Alaska and he's unharmed and he returns to Russia, people say, ha, see, Brian, you're wrong. I'm simply saying there's a high risk that something will happen to President Putin, much higher now than, say, 5 years ago. Seeing how the United States has crossed so many lines that we would have thought were uncrossable. 5 years ago, we've seen the U.S. cross them since then, shooting U.S. and European missiles into targets in Russia, attacking Russia's strategic bomber fleet. These are all things that 5 years ago we would have thought were unthinkable. Harming the president of Russia or China seems unthinkable, but we can see the trajectory all of this is going. It's going in the wrong direction toward peace and prosperity and stability for all. It's going towards more and more direct conflict and more egregious violations of Russia, China, and Iran's sovereignty and national security. And it's going to create a problem for these targeted countries. They're going to have to think about, what do we do? Do we continue allowing the US to salami slice its way to the core of our national security? Or do we draw a red line and enforce it eventually? Again, only time will tell. I'm just laying all of this out so people can see it clearly ahead of the meeting, and so that there's no doubt in anyone's mind when it does become obvious that it was just Minsk 3.0. It isn't because I just guessed correctly. It's because they literally said so themselves. And then they went and they implemented all of it. And then they have this childish narrative about how there's a US-European split. And because many people are emotional rather than logical or objective, they were drawn right into it. And they in their mind, have a left-right paradigm taking place, a perspective, a lens, if you will, that they see reality through. And so that is what made that narrative particularly attractive to them, no matter how irrational in regards to the facts it was. I will continue keeping an eye on this. Of course, the meeting will either take place or it won't. Whatever happens will happen, and I will continue analyzing it as all of this unfolds. If you thought this video
Well, I tell you where you go. Boosty.to/YouTube stuff is getting rich off of this by any stretch of the imagination. And for most of us, when it comes to our time and resources, it's actually pretty costly. But we do it because we believe in what we're doing. So support Mark Sloboda at boosty.to. All right, Mark, let's get going. Before we get started, and I tell you why I'm going to start here. Because I believe everything's generated from what's happening on the battlefield. Let's start with what's happening. You can't understand anything else if you don't understand what's happening on the battlefield. And Mark Sloboda, what's happening on the battlefield?
Garland, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And I can't agree more with you, right? All of this political farcical show that is going to happen in Alaska. And I think it's a mistake for everyone involved. I don't think anything positive is going to come out of this. And I'm almost certain that negative things are coming. But all of it is being driven by what is happening on the battlefield. Absolutely, right? So we saw Trump make threats, right? Unless Putin stops, unless he stops, right? Freezes the conflict, ceasefire, stop killing our proxy regime. Unless you stop, we're going to inflict massive secondary sanctions, secondary tariffs on anyone who still does business with you in 50 days. Russia ignores that, advances on the battlefield. Well, now 10 days or maybe 12, but really quick, right? Russia continues advancing on the battlefield. We're so angry at you, we hit Modi. Bam. and Modi says, Putin keeps advancing on the battlefield. Oh, we got to meet in Alaska. We're going to meet in Alaska, right? Right. All of this is being driven by desperation, by panic, by the need of the U.S., right, as the hegemon. Let's forget the person of Donald Trump, because he's largely irrelevant in structural terms, right, to what is going on. A U.S. proxy regime is facing a absolutely catastrophic military situation. They're facing a deep operational crisis behind their lines in the Donbass, where the majority of the Kiev regime military is, right? In the entire country is still there. The majority is still fighting in the Donbass. They're facing a deep operational crisis because of a deep Russian flanking move that has penetrated through their defenses deep into their rear. A year ago, we were talking about the Ocheretina bloom after punching through Avdiivka, right? This is like that, except because it comes later in the attritional stage, it's even more significant. And therefore, the U.S., they need to stop this conflict now. Just like all the way back in 2015, there was a desperate need after Debaltseve to stop the DPR, the Donetsk militias from completely wiping out the Kiev regime military, right? What military that they had been able to cobble together after their military just kind of disappeared after the Westback Maidan Putsch in 2014. Their military, such that they'd been able to reform, had been defeated. And then Angela Merkel comes running to Moscow to speak to Putin. Freeze! We got to stop things. Ceasefire. Minsk too. Let's settle this diplomatically, right? Well, we're going through the same process again. Now it's Trump, right? Although Trump isn't running the Moscow, at least not yet. Then it's like, why don't you come over to Alaska, right? I know there's some people that are, like, oh, the symbolism. Russia once owned Alaska back in prehistory, and it's symbolic of what? That doesn't mean anything. In fact, evidently, where they're meeting is where some Russian pilots are buried, right? It's a military base. I'm not exactly sure that's the symbolism we want for this. I think it's bad symbolism. Garland, you've seen Return of the Jedi, right? You know that meme when the rebel fleet comes out of hyperdrive or whatever, and they're coming up in Return of the Jedi at the end for the big space battle against the Death Star, and they find that the force shields are up, and the fish guy, the Mon Calamari, Admiral Akbar, is spinning around in his chair going, "It's a trap," right? This is a trap, right? This is, I mean, first of all, we can't completely discount. It's not likely, but we can't even completely discount the idea of a direct trap, because this regime in the U.S. can't be trusted, right? They just feigned diplomatic diplomatic meetings with Iran in order to give Israel a surprise attack and a decapitation strike to attempt to wipe out the Iranian political and military leadership. Right?
There's another important factor, and that is this regime isn't even a unified regime, because one faction could say, we're going to get a deal. And the other faction could say, we got to do something to stop that deal. Let's do something crazy. So if it was just a reckless regime, you'd even be safer.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Trump obviously doesn't have complete control of his government. He's at odds with his blob, his deep state, whatever you want to call it. Even people within his own administration, right? Kellogg, Rubio, they're not on board, with any. Even if Trump was serious about a deal, which I'm not. I don't believe that he has any conviction in that regard. But even if he was, it's moot, right? And you're right. He doesn't have complete control of the government. So whether his administration would follow through, decapitation strike in Iran, decapitation strike Hamas, decapitation strike Hezbollah, him just gloating obscenely in the last week again about his assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian IRGC, whom at one point the U.S. grudgingly admitted was instrumental to defeating ISIS on the ground in Iraq, outside the gates of Baghdad.
Yeah, that's what really pissed them off, if you want the truth, because the ISIS is their boys.
So I don't trust this, right?
Right.
I don't trust him. I don't trust his control over his own crazies, right? I don't trust any of that. But even that aside, this whole thing is designed to be a pressure operation to force Russia to, one, accept the ceasefire, and two, meet with Zelensky as part of that, right? They even tried that, right? Let's meet in Alaska, and then they leaked to the press that Zelensky was going to be there, and then Russia's like, well, we're not coming, and then they leaked to the press that, well, if he's not going to meet with Zelensky, then there is going to be no meeting, and then Russia's like, okay, no meeting then, and then they're like, well, okay, he doesn't have to meet with Zelensky, right? I mean, that was this walk back. And the same thing with sanctions. We're going to sanction them. If he doesn't agree to a ceasefire, there's going to be very severe consequences. Are you going to tariff him? Yeah, there's going to be massive tariffs. And then the next day, well, maybe there'll be tariffs. Maybe there won't be. They're making all sorts of threats. They're already planning the next meeting, right? Between Putin and Zelensky, and Trump just may be there, right? He's not going to be making the deal. They're going to be making the deal, because they're still playing this petty charades game where they pretend that this isn't the U.S.-Russia conflict, even though Rubio at one point actually came out and admitted that this is a U.S. proxy war against Russia, and then they just, never mentioned it again, right? They're still going through this pantomime, this charade. So the next meeting is going to be between Putin and Zelensky, and Russia's like, we're not going to agree to that. And then they're like, well, maybe there won't be a next meeting. We don't know yet, right? All over the place. Just the signaling out of this administration is just, I don't know. I understand there's some people still out there that want to say that this is some kind of 5D chess play to outfox Lindsey Graham and the neocons. No, it's just FUBAR, right? It's the old military acronym. They don't know what the hell they're doing, right? I mean, they want to try to pressure Russia into something to stop beating up on their proxy regime, right? While there's still a proxy regime to save. But they've got no pressure left. They've got no sanctions pressure. They've got no military pressure. They've got nothing. So now they're resorting to some kind of PR pressure, some belief that Trump in the flesh, his massive ego and charisma, or whatever, if you want to call it that, is somehow going to force concessions out of Putin. And none of that's going to happen, right? I mean, they're already saying, right, there's nothing, both sides are saying there's no agreement going to be made out of this, right? There's nothing going to be agreed to. They're walking back expectations, right? They released this. It's just going to be a listening exercise, right? We're just going to feel out the Russians and find out what they really want. As if they haven't been saying what their terms are for a ceasefire, for an end to the conflict ad nauseum since before last June, right? Last June at the minimum. And they're still like, well, we don't know what the Russians want. We've told you what we want. No, but what do you really want? I mean, I know that's what you say, but what will you really accept? No, really, we're winning. We're not going to make any concessions. That's what we want. No, but I mean, really, like behind closed doors. It's the same as in front of doors. No concessions, right? These are our terms. And then when Putin says niet, right? No again, to Trump's face this time, not over the phone, right? All Putin's diplomatic politeness and professional, this game of, because let's be frank, the Kremlin has played the game of playing and trying to manipulate Trump's ego and narcissism, just like everyone else inside and outside of his administration has been doing to him, because that's what he demands, right? He's the God Emperor of mankind. Everyone is supposed to come to his court and pay court to him, right? So yes, Medvedev has said a little more honest words, playing the bad cop, the troll in the background. But Putin has always been unfailingly polite and diplomatic. And Trump has complained about that. We have a really nice conversation. And then the war continues that night, right? Russian airstrikes and drone strikes hit something in Kiev. Well, why didn't he stop? Because we had a nice conversation and I asked him, pretty pleased to. It's just, it's childish. But that's the mentality that they're going into this with. And I'm afraid that when Putin says no again, not over the phone, not through Witkoff and some other intermediary, but to Trump's face, that Trump is going to have a more visceral and emotional reaction and is going to throw the biggest tantrum that we've seen yet, because he's going to be denied something that he both wants and needs. And then the potential for escalation coming out of that is just, I think, not worth whatever farcical show is being put on here. I don't understand the meaning of this. We know that nothing is going to be agreed upon, right? That whatever Trump may believe or want or not want is moot, right? Let's not even try to psychoanalyze Trump going back and forth and whatever. The U.S. Congress is against anything, bipartisan, both sides, right? The deep state, the blob, the pyramid of bureaucracy, the CIA, the State Department, everyone is against anything. The military-industrial complex is against any ending of the conflict. The mainstream media is absolutely vehemently against any type of peace agreement. The Europeans and the Kiev regime are completely against any concessions whatsoever. In fact, they're going even more ridiculous in demands this week. So if Trump, in any span of 15 minutes, had any moment of sincerity, it doesn't matter. That's structural, right? This is structural realism. Trump doesn't have the political ability, the capital, to make the concessions that Russia is demanding, and Russia's not going to back off of their concessions. So why are we doing this? I don't understand the purpose of this. It's going through the diplomatic motions. I don't think that's necessary. Real diplomacy is done by diplomats, right? It's not. Of course, Trump doesn't believe that, right? Trump administration doesn't have the patience or the capability of doing serious diplomacy, right? They're like, yeah, let's negotiate with Iran, and Netanyahu's like, I want to bomb them. They're like, okay, let's do that.
The U.S. doesn't. Biden had Blinken, and the U.S. is incapable. The U.S. because of its internal narrative that it is the hegemon when it ain't. When if it was, it could pick. Yeah, okay, it wouldn't have to. It ain't no more. When it says to India, you better do this, and India says, I'm gonna go over and talk to Beijing. We ain't doing that. You can't force India to do what you want. They can't force anybody to do what they want. When you get to that point, you don't have the capability to dominate anymore. But you know what it's like? The boxer who's like 42 and still thinks he can box, and he goes out and he wants to, the young guys, I'm going to beat you, I'll knock you out of it. That the U.S. doesn't understand that it's 42 and it's out of shape and it can't fight you know what I mean? That's what it is. So mentally, they can talk trash, they can make demands to Russia and China and India. In the real world, people are going to say, no, you can't defeat us on the battlefield. You can't dominate us economically. The days when we had to listen to you are over. And in fact, some people will deliberately push back just to show that they can do it now.
Yeah, I want to draw one distinction, though, because I think the Blinken-Sullivan administration refused, out of ideological, geopolitical terms, to do diplomacy. This administration claims it wants to do them, right? But is mentally and in terms of simple capability, they're of the roster of this administration of doing serious diplomatic work. They're incompetent and incapable of it. Trump has the attention span of some ADHD kid, right, in school. That I mean, no offense to ADHD. It's an analogy, people, right? I realize it's a serious thing or whatever. Trump is not a serious thing. So maybe it's a bad analogy.
Well, don't you have to have here's the thing about it. Blinken was a guy who walked around for 20 years carrying Joe Biden's coat and umbrella. He was had no background, nothing, zero. He had no capability, you know what I mean, to do what he was put in there to do. He wasn't able to do it. Now who's he bringing? Rubio. Rubio's no genius. Rubio's an idiot, in my opinion. I don't think he's smart, and he's hollow. He does what he's told, and power runs through him. He's a conduit. So either way, you have people who, even if they wanted to, and look at Wang Yi and look at Lavrov and look at these guys' background of all of the years learning and studying the trade of what they do. They're competent to do that thing, even whether they want to or not. Our system does not reward competence. It doesn't say we've got to have a guy who's got a background in doing this in order to put him in this position, so that we end up with some schmuck every time.
Yeah. For years on your show, I was calling Blinken's State Department the Department of War, right? It was more peaceful. And then as he left office, the New York Times ran a column admitting, under Blinken, it was really the Department of War, not the Department of State, right? So it's nice the New York Times catch up with us, right? And now we have Rubio. Rubio is not on the same page. He's a neocon. Appointing him as Secretary of State was a political gesture at the neocons, right? To bring them in, to defang them, right? To bring them in to his administration. And anytime that he doesn't agree with something, he's never called on to do anything. He just fades into the background. And Trump sends his real estate developer friend Witkoff to Gaza or to Moscow or whatever. And, he may be, I mean, if you want to consider any New York real estate developers as sincere, good guys, I don't, right? I'm going to be perfectly honest. But, at least he doesn't carry the ideological baggage of a neocon or someone in the deep state. All right. So there's that. But he is incapable of doing the work because he doesn't have the training. It's a double-edged sword, right? If you want someone with the training and the experience, 99 times out of 100, they come with the ideological baggage of U.S. exceptionalism and the bipartisan neocon, dominance of U.S. foreign policy. And if you're looking for someone outside of that, usually they have no experience and no training, and we get Witkoff, right? So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But either way, they're incapable of doing serious diplomatic work. And instead they just, let's just bomb instead, right? I mean, that's been their playbook so far. So I know Putin, they've said outright, yes, we're going to talk about Ukraine, but we're also, being the adults in the room, we want to talk about a common reforged European security architecture. We want to restart serious new arms control limitations, all of this stuff. And none of that is going to happen, right? First of all, no progress is going to be made on anything bilaterally without Putin making concessions on Ukraine, which he's not going to do, right? There was this gesture, Rubio, Lavrov, these talks in Riyadh and everything to restore diplomatic relations to basic functioning level where has that gone? Nowhere, right? It's just completely vanished.
They can't even get direct flights.
You can't even get direct
flights. The most basic, the simplest thing. Donald Trump could pick up a phone. He wouldn't have to write anything and say, hey, FCC, let's do the direct flights. Make it happen tomorrow.
They can't return the U.S. the Russian diplomatic property that they stole, right? And so nothing is going to be done bilaterally, and it's not even a question of just bilaterally without any concessions on Ukraine, which makes it a political impossibility for the Trump administration. I don't think that this administration, these people, are capable of engaging in serious work planning out a common European security architecture into the future, or doing a new START treaty, right, that takes into account AI and hypersonic weapons and all of these drones and all of these new capabilities, right, of bringing China and the UK and France and India and Pakistan, as other nuclear powers that would have to be brought into this in the modern day. It's North Korea, Israel, right? This administration is not competent or capable of engaging in serious, world order stability level diplomatic work like this. They don't have the patience for it. They don't have the mentality or the capability. And it's not just Trump. We all know Trump doesn't have that, right? But the president doesn't necessarily need it. Ronald Reagan didn't need it either. But then they have teams of competent people. I don't see that in this administration. And what competent people they do have, a handful of them, are hamstrung by 5 other people that are just all in completely opposite directions. You got Tulsi Gabbard, and then you got everybody else, right? I mean, that's the story. So I see no potential for anything positive coming out of this, and I only see potential for negative. At best, this is going to be a meaningless photo op where Trump is going to declare victory and say how great it was and so much progress, and then at the end of the day we'll find out a week later that nothing was actually agreed upon and nothing actually happened. That is the best result that we can hope for.
I do have a second thought, just an alternative perspective that
Sure.
I'll throw at you for a second, and that is that the conversation that you and I are having right now is so obvious that Putin and Lavrov, et cetera, are having the same conversation. I don't underestimate those guys. I like to have a talk and say, hey, you know what? I think, I don't know about this. But I also at least think that we should consider the fact, because they've been pretty sharp. I'm not saying they've made everything right, but in comparison to their adversaries, for God's sake, you know what I mean? They've been pretty smart guys. And if you look at what they've done to Russia, how they've turned this country around and what they've done, it's pretty incredible. And historically speaking, to turn a country around, Russia and China, both, what they've done in the last, Russia 25 years, China 40 years, is really incredible. So let me throw this at you. Let's say they know all of this and they got another plan. And
I agree with you. The Kremlin must understand this.
Yeah. So, and they're like, you know what? let me give you just a thought. One of the things, look, the whole conversation in the West is this is a war for conquest and imperialism, and they want to take ground. But that ain't it. That ain't it, and we know that ain't it. But that's why, as they say in Zen, right? The tiger and the shark shall never fight, for they have no common ground, right? That's why there can't be a discussion, really, because as long as I say this is about NATO expansion, and you say, well, let's talk about how much ground you can give. You can take this ground because we know this is about how much ground you want to take, and you want to take land. As long as we do that, we're getting anywhere. What if they look at it possibly, and I think it's possible, as an opportunity to really change the narrative, to sit down and put it in their face. We're here to talk about NATO expansion, but a possibility. Putin had said all along, I ain't talking to Trump. The time will come, we'll talk to Trump. What happened if Witkoff says, okay, you got us. We're willing to sit down and talk about.
Yeah, that's a concession.
Yeah,
Putin made a concession there.
Yeah. So if they said, we're here to talk about NATO expansion, and Putin says, if you're going to talk about NATO expansion, we'll meet you. We'll do that. That's what we want to talk about. You're finally going to accept that? Yes. And then Putin says, well, you know what? They said something acceptable. Not acceptable that we'll end it. Acceptable that we will have the meeting that they've been asking, that we said no. And now they said, okay, we'll talk about NATO. And we'll know based on what happened anyway. I'm just throwing that at you as a possibility that these people are pretty sharp and they know what the hell's going on, and maybe they have an alternative plan. Mark,
I'll one up you. I agree that they must understand that at the very least, right? Let's forget Trump. Let's even forget the U.S. government beyond Trump. Let's just talk in terms of Kiev and Europe. They've been clear they won't agree to any of this, right? So anything that's being talked about. I mean, Russia hasn't talked about anything. The Western media is going crazy with all kinds of rumors and already doing this carving up and swapping of land here and that. And Russia's like, no, we're not actually talking about any of that, right? I mean, that's not what we're talking about. So they can play those games. So the Kremlin must understand that there's no agreement or diplomatic solution going to come out of this talk. Right. So then we come to the point. All right. So we'll attempt to change the narrative. But I think they almost also must understand that when you're playing with Trump and his social media meme machine, that he is just going to trump all over anything intelligent and adult that you try to say. Right. I mean, it's just going to come out in screaming capital letters on Truth Social and in the most childish and puerile and the tantrum that he's going to throw. You can't win that type of narrative game with Trump, because Trump is always going to reduce everything down to the lowest common denominator of online idiocy, which is what he does, right? He brings everything down into the undiplomatic. So they probably also understand that. So then why did they agree to this? I'm genuinely mystified.
Let me throw one at you.
Yeah.
In a couple of weeks, Putin's going to China and Beijing.
Yeah.
I wonder if, I'm not going to say what kind of announcement, but if announcements could be made. If before we have this talk in Beijing and we announce whatever we may announce, I'm not saying it's going to be a military alliance. I'm not going to say what it was, but before he meets there, possibly maybe a good idea to. I'll put it like this, because I'm not going to go down the road based on what I've seen of Lavrov and Putin. I'm not going to go down the road and say they're just a bunch of naive idiots and they don't know what they're doing. I think they're pretty damn smart.
Yeah, they are.
I think we just got to figure them out. But at any rate, your thoughts about, do you think, I don't know, Mark. I don't know. I think
there is the potential that this is all being done to say that they've dotted every I, crossed every T, and made every diplomatic effort possible. Fine. You want to meet in person? We'll play that game too. And that could be done as a nod at India, right, who is now facing potential, it's actually only 25% on 20% of India's actual exports, right? Details that no one wants to examine, right? But it could get worse, right? So making gesture towards the rest of the BRICS leaders, and that both the core BRICS and the new expanded BRICS, right? That we are the diplomatic adults. We tried to do diplomacy. We tried to reason with them, and they just went with this PR show. There's that. I don't think that that's necessary at this point, but I don't know. Maybe they feel it is. So that is a possible rationale for this.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what we hear. But at any rate, let's your thought. We've been for I don't know how long. We've been talking, me and you, and lots of people have been talking about the word, using this word. I've started using it from the beginning: collapse on the battlefield. And as I look at what's happening, it's kind of the old saying about the person who went broke, right? First slowly and then suddenly, right? It seems that this attritional warfare has been, nicking away at the foundation of Ukrainian military power, and it seems to be in deep trouble. And of course, that's what this is about. But it seems that, because what would happen is, like me and other people say, yeah, it looks like this fall's it. That's it. Ukraine's done this fall. And then the fall would go by and Russia would keep doing what he did. Okay, I guess the spring there'll be a bigger fight. Yeah, I'm really starting to finally feel as though, somebody's yanking that last block out of the Jenga thing and the whole wooden little structure's going to drop. It looks like there's problems there. Your thoughts on what you know about the battlefield and your evaluation of where we are.
Okay, so what we've had it's been building up over the last month and has in the last 2 or 3 weeks really exploded is this deep flanking operation around Pokrovsk and between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka in South Central Donbass, that there has now been an even deeper north and western penetration around Pokrovsk that has punched through all the Kiev regime's defenses, including reportedly the new defensive line that they were erecting behind the last defensive line of Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. They just punched deep into the Kiev regime's operational rear and are wreaking havoc. And the Kiev regime can't seem to do anything to stop them. They've called up Azov now, although I don't expect them to do any more than anything else. So, and all the Kiev regime military commanders are screaming about this, and it's become clear one of the major reasons for this is the Kiev regime's manpower woes, right? They do not have enough infantry to defend the contact line, not even where it's hottest, right, around Pokrovsk, much less the entirety of the contact line. And Russia, they successfully infiltrated groups past the contact line, built up a critical mass, and discovered a window of opportunity, right? And they just, boom, they went for it, right? So we've got this deep penetration, penetration now. And it is a result of nearly 3 years of attritional strategy. The butcher's bill of that strategy is coming due now, right? Because in terms of manpower, the Kiev regime's military is now down to probably around 200,000 vaguely combat capable people left now, while the Russian military just keeps getting bigger and bigger and stronger every month, right? That gap keeps growing every day, right? The Russian military is getting bigger and more experienced, and the Kiev regime military is getting smaller, and they're losing what people they had with any military experience and training increasingly. So the gap just keeps growing enormously. Now that said, this word collapse has just been tossed around from the beginning of this conflict. I remember in the very beginning of the conflicts, I was on shows with some other analysts. They're like, oh, they're going to collapse in 2 months. It'll all be over. And they've been saying the same thing again and again and again for 3 months. And I don't know. I've always been of the opinion that this is going to be a long, hard, bloody, nasty war. And I still don't think it's over yet. I see lots of holes. I see crumbling, right? But I will admit that I have continually been amazed at how this regime has been able to mass conscript people and force them to fight and die for it. And when they're in a normal situation, if it was you or me, I mean, yes, they've had 400,000 some desertions, right? But even then, how many haven't? I'm always continually amazed that they're still fighting. I know the Banderites will fight to the bitter end and beyond. We'll be dealing with undead Banderites coming out of the grave in Lvov for the next century, probably, right? But when we're not talking about the ideologicals, there's still enough that they've just managed to coerce and to create the military structures where they are forced to fight and die. And I know a lot of people just want to believe that at some point they're just not going to be able to fight anymore and it's just going to be over the next day. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think we are seeing a crumbling, but the collapse isn't going to be dramatic and sudden. And even when that quote unquote collapse happens, that doesn't mean that the military conflict is over, because there's still a core 100,000, 75,000, 100,000 neo-Nazis, Banderites in this country. They're not going to surrender, right? Even if Zelensky did, and he's a delusional, he's fully on board. I mean, he's crazy at this point. Zelensky's, his own people said he's messianic, right? That he's the emperor with no clothes. He makes Trump look sane. He's not going to back down. He's not going to surrender. He's internalized all of this Banderite. He wasn't when he came in, but he's internalized it all. So I think they'll fight. Their combat capability will continue to go down. But at the end of the day, there are still a certain amount of people that will fight, no matter, we're talking guerrilla warfare, terrorism, the very nastiest things that are already, occurring at some level. And Ukraine is very, very big. And if they don't surrender, right? If they don't just give up, that means Russia has got to go building to building in this enormous country and then expend troops to physically occupy every town and settlement and so forth. That's a long, hard, bloody process, even after the Kiev regime is attrited down to the point where they can't strategically resist anymore. It's still going to be a long, I'm afraid that it's going to be a long, and there's just not going to be a clean, quick victory. Mearsheimer said it again and again. I love the description. Russia's going to win, but it's going to be an ugly victory, right? Like Syria. Russia won in Syria, but it was an ugly victory, right? The U.S. and the Kurds camped out in 1/3 of the country. The Turks and Al-Qaeda and the 99 flavors of jihad camped out in the north of the country. And then ultimately, Russia lost the peace. So people should not celebrate too much. People should, and I assume that the Russian military is there, that the Kremlin is there, but I also think that in the alt media, we also need to caution people to just be cautious, to not expect too much. Putin said this to Lukashenko just a couple weeks ago, or was it last week even? And I believe he was actually addressing Trump. That this type of disappointment and frustration comes from an excess of expectations. Let's not our expectations run away. They're just when it comes to military, there's very rarely quick, clean victories, right? And even the U.S. in Iraq, right, in 2003. Oh, that's it. Saddam regime is gone, and he's dead and hanged, and we can remake the Middle East now. 5 years later, into a bloody occupation, and I'm not saying that that's what's necessarily what's going to happen, and certainly not in all of Ukraine. But what I'm saying is, real war, real conflict, these real things, these are dirty, nasty, bloody things, and they don't often end in the modern day with this Westphalian signature and peace and things like that, like World War II ended. We should not expect something like that.
I also think that with Russia, the real change that will eventually come, I agree with you, but because what you're talking is, this is Europe's plan. They're not stupid. Well, they are stupid, but they know, okay, we're going to lose this.
They're crazy. They're not stupid. They're crazy.
Right. And so it's okay, we're going to lose this, but who cares? The Ukrainians will get wiped out, so they're expendable. But then we'll reform Zelensky in Paris or some friggin' where. We'll say we have a government outside, in exile, and then we'll try to keep whatever. That's their plan anyway. I do think the long term is this. I do think there will be a whole lot of regime change over the next 10 years in Europe, and a whole lot of dysfunction and political instability in Europe. But we don't know what's going to happen. But I think that is going to have a dramatic effect on this thing. But I think you're right. This is a long-term project. Russia didn't have any other options. We got 10 minutes left, Mark. 9, actually, before I got to run. I want to ask you about the Caucasus, which again is evidence. Hey, let's make a deal. You're trying to stick a knife in my back. At the same time, you're telling me let's make a deal about the front, and you got a knife pointing my back.
Okay, so let me just finish up what you were saying there to punch it home. Almost every single European political and military leader right now, just do a Google search on it, is saying that they expect to be at war with Russia in somewhere between 2 or 5 or 10 years, right? They all say it to a man, right? That's all Russia's going to invade us, rather than we're going to send troops into Ukraine or Moldova or Belarus or wherever. But Europe is never going to agree to a peace, and I don't think the U.S. intends to either, right? They just reprioritizing things. They want to go deal with China, and they don't want to deal with Russia. They want Europe to pick up the burden share there. That doesn't mean that they want to come to an advantageous peace with Russia. They just want to dump it all on Europe and let Europe carry it forward. At least the Trump administration, Trump himself does. With regards to the South Caucasus, exactly, right? They're talking, an end to the conflict and everything. And like, all right, well, we got to freeze this thing and wind this thing down in Ukraine. It's not going the way we wanted it to right now. Let's restart it up in a few years. And meanwhile, we find another place to provoke another area to gain advantage against Russia. And right now, that is the South Caucasus. And we talked about this several times over the last few weeks. I did a video on it on my own channel a month ago about the Zangezur corridor, right, in Armenia, between both sides of Azerbaijan, with Turkey leaning in on this, and what a geopolitical hotspot, and how it was coming to the fore. And now Trump has arranged a peace agreement, right, whereby the pro-Western prime minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, has essentially found a way to move Armenia into the West's sphere of influence, right? He wishes that little landlocked, poor Armenia in the South Caucasus, right, stuck between, in the Caucasus, in a mountain hilliness environment between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, but Armenia having a border with neither of those, right? He wishes Armenia was some little island stuck somewhere in the Atlantic between the US and the UK. It's not, right? It's there. And yes, there's lots of political opposition to him from the church, from the conservative, everything at home that he's stamping down on. But he has found the way to become geopolitically important to the West, and he believes then drawn into the West sphere of influence, and thus escape the Russian sphere of influence, and actually to collapse the Russian sphere of influence in the South Caucasus, because Russia still has military bases in Armenia. But effectively, what he's done is surrendered Armenia in the pursuit of this to its two historical, traditional enemies, Azerbaijan and Turkey. Right. First, he surrendered the occupied territories. All right. Well, they probably should have been given back a long time ago anyway, but also Nagorno-Karabakh. And now he's surrendered this southern Armenia, this Suksian province, the Zangezur corridor, that bisects mainland Azerbaijan from the Nakhchivan autonomous region tucked up against Turkey. And he's surrendered this, right? And he didn't surrender it to the Azerbaijan. They've discovered a mechanism to bring the West in. They've surrendered it to the US, right? This is someone, I believe that this may have actually been Erdogan's, it's just Erdogan's stink to it, because he's heavily involved in this. Now, what this will allow them to do, other than cut Russia out of the South Caucasus, but it's pipeline politics. You can put pipeline Azerbaijani gas directly then through Armenia, through Nakhchivan and Turkey and into Europe, right? To provide another energy supply to Europe, not dependent at all on Russia. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan is growing closer to the Kiev regime in Ukraine and assisting them in a whole variety of ways all the time. And Pashinyan is on board on this. There's even rumors that Trump is talking about attempting to bring both Azerbaijan and Armenia together into NATO. And all Pashinyan had to do with this is surrender his country to their ancient enemies, the Turks and the Azerbaijan, right, to become geopolitically important to the West, such that they were willing to expend. And, right, there's a lot of problems with this, right? It's all supposed to be done by some US PMC that doesn't even exist yet. This has got to be shoved through the Armenian legislature, right? They've got to make constitutional changes.
Yeah,
there could be a civil war in Armenia.
And Iran says they may go to war.
Iran, because this Armenia has a border with Iran where they do trade. And Iran sees this as an existential threat to them, to their north, right? And we can't have a U.S. military base, right up there in that section as well, too. They're saying, at least, they're willing to go to war. Russia's being a lot quieter right now because I think they believe that this is not going to work, right? This is some kind of Hail Mary pass into the South Caucasus. One, it's got to be shoved through what I believe is a majority domestic political opposition in Armenia to all of this. And two, logistically, it's like some kind of crazy modern day Berlin airlift. How does the US military or even a PMC working with the military maintain and govern something in a landlocked country on the other side of the Black Sea like this? I think Russia's like,
in a way, it's like, yes, we'll be right on their border, but in a way, you're trapped.
Yeah,
in a way, they could obliterate you. I mean, if you put nukes in there or something like that, but then that's war. But you'd be that base there would be a right target for obliteration in about 10 seconds if anything started. I won't be on that. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, it's really strange. I think Russia and Iran are both caught flat-footed by this. They haven't agreed on a response yet. They haven't decided on one because they think this is crazy. What are they doing, right? This can't possibly work. Well, we'll see that going forward, whether it works or not. But even the attempt is kind of a geopolitical coup d'etat by Trump, right, in the South Caucasus. He's attempting to take the South Caucasus, something that is heavily Soviet Russian sphere of influence, with then Iran to a certain extent too, and cutting them both out of this, leaving, by the way, Erdogan free to pursue pan-Turkic dreams, of neo-Ottoman dreams through the region, which is a whole nother problem. But the idea that the U.S. can just turn over from outside the theater and completely take over the geopolitical influence in the South Caucasus overnight. Like I said, it's a crazy, hazy Hail Mary pass. And I think one of the reasons that Russia's response has been so restrained yet, they're like, there's no way this is going to work. But it doesn't mean they shouldn't decide on a response. They have better come up with a response, and it better be a good one, because even crazy sometimes can seriously upset. At the end of the day, Russia has, and it's been on a trajectory a long time, to lose influence in the South Caucasus, right? It has maintained influence there since the dissolution of the Soviet Union by balancing the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And let's be frank, often playing them against each other. That is gone now. Azerbaijan won the conflict. Pashinyan is a pro-Western leader who's so determined to bring Armenia into the West that he surrendered his country to the Azerbaijanis and the Turks. And so that balance, that equilibrium, that playing, that whole game is gone now, right? The whole political structure of Russian influence in the South Caucasus is gone. Obviously, that's going to lead almost certainly to a decrease in Russian influence. And that's okay, right? I mean, Russia has different geopolitical horizons than the Soviet Union. And yes, they're far more focused on what's going on in Ukraine right now as the most essential thing. That's understandable. But eventually they're going to have to come back and deal with this in one way or another. It's okay that they lose influence there, right? They were prepared for that. They were prepared under the 2020 ceasefire agreement that they brokered between Armenia and Azerbaijan to open the Zangezur corridor to Azerbaijan, but under their control, under Russian border patrol control, right? That was the deal. Now they've been cut out of everything altogether. So while it's not a problem for them to lose influence, it's another thing entirely for the U.S. to just drop into the South Caucasus and say, this is ours now. That's a problem. They're going to have to.
I'm just about out of time, Mark. So let me remind everybody.
I can handle it. I'm 6'2".
He signed up for this.
I'm pretty strong. She's 5'4". All right, let's get into it, shall we? Well, there is hope for peace. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz this morning after meeting with Ukrainian dictator Zelensky and President Trump. Germany, which of course has sent 47 billion euros in aid to Germany. Germany, which has trained Ukrainian soldiers on its own soil. Germany, which has provided countless tanks and weapons. Germany says there's hope for peace in Ukraine. Okay, pinch me already. I don't know if I believe this, but side note, Germany also just approved the buying of U.S. weapons to send to Ukraine, so pinch me with a grain of salt, I suppose. Meanwhile, on the Russian side of things, just a few hours ago, Russia warned the world that Ukraine is preparing false flag events to sabotage the peace talks with a major bombing of a hospital or other civilian areas inside of Russia or in the Kharkov region. Russia says they have intelligence showing that this is coming. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has delivered a blunt message to Putin ahead of their scheduled summit in Alaska, warning that if the Russian leader isn't serious about ending the war in Ukraine, there will be, quote, very severe consequences, end quote. Trump told reporters on Wednesday that he expects to know within the first 2 minutes of this meeting whether Putin is negotiating in good faith or not, while he declined to spell out exactly what measures he might take. What would these severe consequences actually look like? Would they be economic, political, financial, military? We don't know. Trump made clear that Moscow would face a strong response if the talks didn't lead towards peace. And he said, I don't have to say what they will be, but there will be very severe consequences. So that's a little harsh, because Trump was just asked if he thinks this meeting will be successful. And he said, the meeting sets up a second meeting, which I'm not quite sure I understand fully here, but there's a 25% chance that this will go well. Listen.
This meeting sets up the second meeting. The second meeting is going to be very, very important, because that's going to be a meeting where they make a deal. And I don't want to use the word divvy things up, but, to a certain extent, it's not a bad term, okay? But there will be a give and take as to boundaries, lands, et cetera, et cetera. The second meeting is going to be very, very important. This meeting sets up, it's like a chess game. This meeting sets up the second meeting. But there is a 25% chance that this meeting will not be a successful meeting, in which case I will run the country, and we have made America great again already in 6 months.
And you'll hit them with consequences, right? You'll hit them with more sanctions. The Senate sanctions go front and center if he disrespects. Yeah.
Oh, sure. If it's not solved, look, again, we didn't lose any soldiers. We didn't lose anybody. But this was a war. If I didn't get in here, this could have been World War III.
I recognize the war-loving voices of Fox and Friends saying, oh, but we can still have more war, right? If it doesn't keep going.
Severe consequences,
then
please? Can we have
keep
severe
the war
consequences?
going, which we've loved.
Yeah, we love war, so we want to keep this going, right? We really want to keep Ukraine. We want to wipe Ukraine off the map through this NATO proxy war, so we'll continue to do that, right? And I should clarify something I said earlier. So there's a 25% chance this will not go well, is what President Trump is saying here. So Dave DeCamp is the editor of one of my favorite websites, antiwar.com. It's a website I read not only every morning, I think I read it like 4 or 5 times a day. And Dave is joining us here finally on the show after many, many years, I think, of trying to get David on. Great to finally have you here. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about this summit and all of the pieces that are moving. You watch this very, very closely. I mean, there's the military side of it and big moves and breakthroughs on the Russian side over the past 48 hours. There is this new report of a potential false flag attack against civilians, the Russian Ministry of Defense is pointing out. And then there is we're hearing positive signs kind of around the world, from Germany to Ukraine, that this could go well. What do you think we can expect tomorrow in Alaska?
Yeah, when we're also seeing something Putin said today was actually that the president and the Trump administration has been sincerely trying to end the war in Ukraine. And I do think there is some truth to that President Trump probably does want this war to end. But the problem is that Zelensky, all the Europeans, you mentioned MERS, he's saying that there's a chance for peace. I find that really just hard to believe at this point because of these meetings and discussions that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are having, the so-called red lines that Zelensky has set, which include not giving up any territory that Ukraine still controls. They want something like $500 billion to $1 trillion from Russia to pay for reconstruction. And they want NATO-like security guarantees. I think they've accepted that they're not actually going to join NATO, but they're still asking for these, security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5. So these demands are just non-starters for Moscow, and Russia and Putin are not in any position where they're going to compromise. So what Trump is saying, they're calling this a feel-out meeting. He's going to go in there and feel them out and get the terms from Russia and bring them back to Ukraine and Europe. And, so if Trump is happy with the terms, there's still a lot of other people that need to agree to them. So just based on those positions, it's hard to believe that there's going to be peace here. Now, another question is, how much leverage does Trump have with Ukraine? I believe he has a lot, considering he's still providing weapons and intelligence. And is he willing to use that leverage to get Zelensky to make the concessions? That's another big factor in this. And then the other question is there a potential, even if the war doesn't end, for some kind of deal, some kind of agreements between the U.S. and Russia on the arms control front? Maybe some things are possible there, but I think if they don't really make any progress on this issue of this war in Ukraine, then they're not really going to go that far.
Well, now the Telegraph is reporting that there may be some kind of resource deal, whereas the Trump administration would very much like access to the resources that are mined out of eastern Ukraine, which now is Russia. But what do we have to offer to Russia? Because Russia is not hurting for any of these resources in the same way that we are.
Yeah, I read that report. Some of the stuff I've seen from British media just doesn't make sense to me. Because, right, like you said, like, what does the U.S. have to offer Russia? Oh, you get some minerals in Western Ukraine. I mean, is that going to be the offer here? And I also saw there was discussion. I believe it was the Telegraph, or maybe it was the Times of London. They had a report saying that the U.S. and Russia discussed a West Bank style occupation of Eastern Ukraine, which, I mean, I just can't believe that it's a discussion that anybody looks at the West Bank and says, oh, that's a good model for a peace deal here. So, a lot of this stuff is just delusional that I think that we see coming from these, we see the way Merz and Macron and Rutte, the head of NATO, the way that they talk about Russia is that they're preparing for a war with Russia in a few years. That's the rhetoric, is that Russia's going to, invade Eastern Europe and it's going to be on. And with that attitude and these demands about Ukraine that are just unrealistic, they're not on a good path. And again, the big question is what can Trump do? What leverage can he use if he really wants peace here? What could he do? Because what's his other option? The war continues. Is he going to go back and ask Congress for money for Ukraine? I mean, that would be a total betrayal of his base and what he campaigned on.
So maybe you could break down sort of the framework here, Dave, which is like, because the Kremlin has revealed their side of this sort of, pieces of this and what's sort of coming together here. Five of their delegates will be going there and having these high level meetings. What do you think we're going to see tomorrow? It happens at 11:30 Anchorage time tomorrow. So that's like 1:30 our time here in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains. So as far as like the framework, and we know that they're going to have like a joint press conference afterwards. What are, like, do you think the biggest sticking points right now at that 11:30 when they sit down at that table?
Yeah, well, it's going to start, as I understand it, as a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin. And I think this is provides Putin with a good opportunity to try to convince Trump, that why, his reasoning for these being his red lines. And then the idea is it's not clear exactly how long that one-on-one is going to be. And then it's going to go to the other officials, the rest of the delegation is going to come in. And they're saying, the bulk of the meeting is going to be about Ukraine. And Trump has been just kind of sending mixed. It's really hard to kind of nail down what he's thinking. He's been kind of like he's talking about land swaps and everything. But it seems like he does have to understand that in order for there to be peace, Ukraine is going to have to cede some land. And according to the reports that we see, Russia has apparently offered that they would end the war if Ukraine withdrew from Donetsk in the Donbass, and then that they would freeze the lines elsewhere, which is a climb down from Russia's earlier demand that Ukraine should pull out of all the oblasts that Russia annexed back in 2022. So I think the land is a big thing. And then it gets onto the neutrality issue, which was Russia's main demand when the short-lived negotiations were happening in the beginning of the war. Their main demand was Ukrainian neutrality. And that's something, I mean, you see Starmer and them, they're talking about sending troops to Ukraine to enforce a peace deal. I mean, again, it's just completely insane what they're talking about.
This big show that they made of a big conference call yesterday, this Zoom meeting, and now they're hugging each other as if like they are brave to stand up to Russia. And I just think now, I mean, I realize there were the initial idiots in 2022 who put Ukraine flags in their bio and bought the party line. Who is this for now? Do those idiots still exist?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
who are the idiots besides those people who were on the conference call?
Yeah, I guess it's like the European elites, people in Brussels. I mean, it is hard to that's why, like, when we see them talk about this stuff, like Russia's this big threat to Europe, I mean, it's just, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
It doesn't pass the smell test at all, logically. And Russia has enough territory. When you look at the map, literally, we just went to our kids' orientation for school and all that, and the teacher has a big world map up there, and it's like, if you just stand there and stare at Russia and the sheer size of that thing, do you think that Russia wants to also put Belgium in its back pocket, wants to control Spain, it's just a stupid argument. But it'll be interesting to see what concessions on the land side. I mean, these people voted overwhelmingly in what was Eastern Ukraine to become part of the Russian Federation. So do you think we're going to see any of that land given up by Russia? I mean, Russia holds all the cards here. They're going to say, yeah, take Donbass back, take Donetsk back, take Luhansk back, take those areas back that you've been carrying out a genocide since 2014 against the ethnic Russians that live there. Take that land back, totally undo everything that we've done.
The will of those people.
I mean, I see no scenario where Russia's handing any land back that they control. And actually, according to the reports that we've seen, Ukraine, their position is essentially, we're not going to give up any territory we control, which suggests that they are accepting that they're not going to, that they could freeze the lines and, accept reality that they're not going to win that territory back. One important point I want to make that just popped in my head, there was just a poll from Gallup that found 69% of Ukrainians across Ukraine want a peace deal as soon as possible. And only something like 22% want to continue fighting until victory, whatever victory means at this point. So, and that's a switch. When the war first started, it was basically the opposite results. So I think that's important here, and hopefully something that Trump is aware of, that the Ukrainian people want a peace deal at this point, overwhelmingly. Of course, Zelensky doesn't, because, this is how he's going to hold on to power.
If the right people have communicated that message to Trump, that's part of the problem here. It's like the gatekeepers, the war hawks, the neocons that seem to keep a certain information away from Trump on a regular basis. So that's the Russia side. Dave, I want to ask you about Gaza. IDF has just approved plans for the conquest of Gaza, even though Satan himself, Benjamin Netanyahu, says he doesn't want to keep it. Like, we're going to just go in there but we're not going to keep it. We're just going to
set up a Palestinian territory that is run by people who are favorable to Israel, is what he says.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the second part of this is the Israel-Iran war. The second part of that phase appears to be ready to kick off. A number of MAGA influencers and others were flown in to meet with Netanyahu and Mike Huckabee, and this whole, posting on social media. So it seems like the propaganda is already being lined up for this next round of attacks against Iran. Where do things stand?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Gaza, according to Israeli media, the plans that they just approved involve forcibly displacing 1.2 million people. That's the estimate of Palestinian civilians in Gaza City. And that includes about 700,000 people who lived there before and 500,000 refugees from other parts of Gaza. And the report says that, they know that they're going to issue the evacuation order and some people are going to stay, because where else are they going to go? Some people have been displaced like 10 times. It says that for the people who don't go, they're going to pressure them to leave by firing artillery into the area. So this is a monstrous plan that they have here. And then the plan is to go into Gaza City, capture it, and then spend a year destroying it. They frame it as dismantling Hamas infrastructure. But if you look to the north of Gaza City, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Jabalia, these towns and cities have been completely destroyed. And that's what they want to do to Gaza City. And yet, they're going to do that and then let them back in. I mean, it's just a joke. And we see Netanyahu also openly talking about, it's open that they want the ethnic cleansing. They call it voluntary migration, which again is just it's voluntary migration under the threat of death by starvation or bombing. So this escalation, which Trump appears to be ready to support, comes as, the daily death toll has been horrific, around 100 every day. People getting killed trying to get food, children starving to death, and adults. And we're actually seeing people starve to death every single day now, as much as Israel and its supporters want to downplay it. So if they go through with this escalation, those deaths are going to get much higher. And it's just, going to go into, I think, like the final solution phase of this genocide ethnic cleansing campaign. So you have that on top of the tensions with Iran. So I know, I'm sure you guys saw Netanyahu's recent interview where he said that he was very supportive of the idea of a greater Israel, which is really kind of just amazing to see him actually discuss that in an Israeli media interview.
Finally admit it, because they've been denying it for so long. So the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, right? Like, no, we don't want a greater Israel. That's a lie. That's just something that, you know, anti-Semites say on social media. And here is Netanyahu admitting it publicly.
As a spiritual calling. He says it's a historic and spiritual mission.
Yeah. And we've seen this from members of his government, especially Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. And they're kind of, you know, he's openly talked about taking territory in Lebanon, Syria, all these places. And he's kind of framed as, you know, the extremist in the government, but this is the prime minister himself talking about this. And this gets into the problem with Iran. Well, it's not really a problem, but from Israel's perspective, this is the problem. Iran is essentially the only country left in the region that can do significant damage and to Israel. And we saw that during the 12-day war. You know, they tried to frame it as a victory, but Iran was able to do pretty significant damage with their ballistic missiles to Israel up until the final moments of the war. And, you know, because they don't want anybody challenging their, territorial expansion when it comes to the West Bank, Gaza, southern Lebanon, Syria. So they just don't want any states intact that can threaten them. And so that is the real goal. Trita Parsi wrote a great analysis of this in Foreign Policy, kind of summarizing this stuff, saying, that was one goal of this 12-day war, was to make Iran similar to Syria and Lebanon, like a country that Israel can just bomb by itself with impunity. But they didn't succeed at that. So for this reason and other reasons, Netanyahu wants another war here. And he wants the U.S. to be very much involved, more so than just bombing the nuclear facilities.
Because the propaganda is strong. I mean, even someone in our chat just said, yeah, but what about all of Hamas stealing all of these aid trucks, all the videos coming out of Hamas stealing aid trucks? So people fall for this propaganda, right? I mean, can you first of all address that? Like, has Hamas been stealing aid trucks on purpose? And, how do they sell this whole thing to people? I mean, the support for this has absolutely plummeted. Young people in the United States who are Trump supporters do not want this at all. So they've completely lost the narrative.
Yeah, so the narrative from Israel is that Hamas, there's this large scale stealing of aid by Hamas. And we've actually seen reporting from Reuters, the New York Times, that said that there's actually no evidence of this systematic looting of aid by Hamas. But we have seen other armed groups loot aid. And the fact is, Israel maintained a total blockade on Gaza for almost 3 months and then started allowing, a very small number of aid trucks in. So right now what you see a lot is just crowds of desperate people basically raiding the trucks and grabbing what they can, and in some cases getting shot by the IDF. And some of the videos we've seen, I know there was one recently of like armed men on these aid trucks, but those were people acting as security against the looters. The fact is, Israel has destroyed Gaza, and they imposed, again, a total blockade where people couldn't get any food. The stocks ran out. So when you send aid trucks into that, you just send a few in, you're going to see looting and everything. And also, this was revealed recently. There's a gang in Gaza known as the Abu Shabab gang, named after its leader. In 2024, there was reporting that this guy, Abu Shabab, his gang was responsible for the most looting of aid trucks in Gaza. And he actually, in the interview with the Washington Post, he admitted to taking from trucks. He claimed that they didn't take food, but he admitted to looting trucks. Well, guess who he is getting weapons from now? He's being armed by Israel, this gang.
Israel.
Yeah, the Washington Post surprisingly reported that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
They followed him around.
How these armed gangs are being funded and actually supported by Israel
and protected
and given weapons. Yeah. It's not Hamas, it's other groups, but now they're it's beautiful. It's beautiful propaganda, and it works like these sort of false flag strategies. Like, look at these armed Hamas group. No, sorry.
If a guy, just the way like the Israeli surveillance, I mean, they have drones everywhere. Israel can see everything. At this point, if a guy in Hamas with a rifle like shows his head on the surface, he's going to get hit with a drone strike or something. Like, right. So if you see armed groups kind of just out and about, generally they're backed by Israel in some way. It does seem like they've tolerated some of the clans, some of the tribal groups acting as security in certain parts. But overall, we've seen some reports, again, from Israeli media that they were backing these gangs in these places and even backing them in fights against Hamas and everything. So this is part of Israel's strategy here to kind of divide.
Yeah, someone in our chat says, yes, they are. Nerdvana says, yes, they are promoters of BS. Exactly right. That's exactly what Israel's been doing.
I want to ask, is there any way to revive the Iran has nukes excuse to go to war? Because it feels like the United States has kind of robbed them of that, because we are pretending that we took out all the nukes and that was Israel's main use for escalation. How are they going to escalate with Iran now? Or is it just they don't need to because the world will not stop them?
Yeah, well, I think with the nuclear thing, there is a way. They have a path toward kind of finding a pretext. One thing that's happened, so Iran, there's no evidence that they had any nuclear weapons program, that they made any move toward building a nuclear weapon before Israel launched the war. And this was confirmed by U.S. intelligence and the IAEA, even though the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, they had a resolution that condemned Iran, accusing them of violating their non-proliferation commitments. And that was mostly based on alleged nuclear activity from like 20 years ago. So there was no threat of proliferation before Israel started the war. But they passed that resolution on June 12th. Israel started the war on June 13th. So it was very clearly like they piggybacked on that IAEA resolution. So after the war, Iran has suspended cooperation with the IAEA, kicked them out because they saw them as complicit in the war. And now we have France, the UK, and Germany threatening to reimpose the so-called snapback sanctions on Iran that were part of the nuclear deal from 2015. There were UN Security Council sanctions that were lifted. And they're threatening to reimpose these sanctions if Iran doesn't enter nuclear talks with the US, basically. And Iran's position is that they want assurances they won't be attacked again before they enter talks, which I think is a pretty reasonable position.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, to get back to the potential pretext, some Iranian officials, I don't know if this is their official position, but have said, if those snapback sanctions come back on, then we're going to leave the non-proliferation treaty. And, just as kind of a symbolic, they want there to be consequences to this action. So if Iran leaves that treaty, then I think that's the pretext that Israel is going to jump on. At the same time, I'm sure Iran is aware of that. But I think that is a potential path where they could start up kind of the nuclear scare again. And the irony,
the
of
treaty
course,
that
is
Israel is not a party
exactly.
to.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make. Yeah, that's the big. I mean, it's
they have nukes. They torture their whistleblowers who told us that, and yet they don't have to be a part of it. That's rich.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Someone in our chat says, is this channel anti-Israel? No, we are vehemently anti-war on this channel. And therefore, the reason we had Dave DeCamp on, the editor of antiwar.com, we are vehemently anti-war on this show. I encourage all of you to read the website. It's a great website, antiwar.com. Please go and check it out. It's part of my daily reading.
Same. And I would say it's the only news outlet that has never once pissed me off by an outright lie that I can see. Nobody else has that medal but you.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't like the content, none of us like it.
Yeah, I wish one day I would go to antiwar.com and it'd be blank. Like
yeah. Me too. Yeah, I could use some time off. But I really appreciate that. We appreciate all your work at antiwar.com. And Natalie, I'll actually see you this weekend at the Ron Paul Institute conference.
Love it.
So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Ron Paul is celebrating his 90th birthday and a big event, anti-war, pro-peace event. And you're going to be speaking there. And that's great. Great to see Dave will be there as well. And there'll be hundreds of people there watching as well. So Dave, great to see you. Thank you so much for all of your work. It's really
Marciano fought Don Coquel, the horizontal Trump? Has there been a mismatch, diplomatically speaking, like the one that's shaping up, limbering up, getting its shape together in Anchorage, Alaska? It's Donald Trump and Marco Rubio versus Vladimir Putin and the legendary, absolute kingpin of diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. If it were down to the negotiating skills, the diplomatic finesse of one side, it would be a no contest, just like Marciano versus Don Coquel. But it's more complicated than that. The art of the deal is said to be Donald Trump's strongest suit. Well, we'll see about that. The current evidence of it is not so great for the great charmer. The dogs barking off at the heels of Donald Trump, of course, are intended to circumscribe the room for maneuver that he might have in any negotiations. So we'll soon see whether he's a man or a mouse. Is he cowed by Mark Rutte and Fred Merz and Macron and Keir Starmer? Who is he listening to? Is he listening to the needs of the American economy, the American people, the geopolitical and military realities on the ground in Ukraine, or is he listening to these dogs barking? We'll soon see. The truth is that Zelensky is going weak at the knees. As a matter of fact, I saw him trembling on a piece of footage just the other minute, whether it was chemically induced or whether it was mere stress and anxiety at the fact that a foreign president is negotiating on his behalf in a talk that is destined to decide the whole future of his country, and he's not important enough to be there. Of course, as Donald Trump rightly said in the Oval Office just a few months ago, he doesn't have any cards. He's gambling with World War III, and he's a little dictator whose mandate has run out. So there's every justification for refusing to allow Zelensky a place at the iceberg that is the Alaska talks. But the call today with European Union leaders was sufficiently filled with portentous threats and defiance that Trump felt the need to again insult and threaten Russia. Now, I don't know Mr. Lavrov well. I don't know Mr. Putin well, though I have met both of them several times now. They never struck me as the type of people who need, first of all, to run off at the mouth at every student TV camera, or for that matter, as people easily intimidated. Because the facts of the matter are clear enough. The Russian armed forces are advancing across the front at pace. 110 square miles of Ukraine has been taken by the advancing Russian forces just in the last 2 days. That's a lot of territory. And the encirclement of Pavlovsk looks almost certain to be completed, if not by Friday, then definitely by the weekend, meaning another hugely significant military defeat for the armed forces of Ukraine, who, despite fighting bravely for all this time, are now clearly in a state of disarray. Their morale is so poor that thousands are deserting and walking across to the Russian lines. The replacements are having to be seized with ever more extreme violence from the streets and prized from the arms of their mothers, wives, and sweethearts as they're bundled into a van, given a rifle, and sent to the front line where their life expectancy is sometimes measured in hours rather than days. The internal squabbling in the Ukrainian regime is reaching fever pitch. The Vogue magazine has already told us who the American choice for Zelensky's replacement is. And it seems overwhelmingly likely that whoever is making the phone calls to Donald Trump from now on, it will not be Volodymyr Zelensky. He will leave with black bin bags stuffed with cash, although he's already transferred a very great deal of your money, Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer, in Europe and in North America. He's already transferred untold millions, maybe billions, of the money that your taxes gave him, but he'll no doubt want some ready cash in a black bin bag or 200 or 300 on his way out of the door. That's if he's lucky. If he's unlucky, he'll go the way of the Diem brothers in South Vietnam, set up by the American security services for assassination. We must hope that he is spared that ending. But definitely, like the Mare Celeste, he will forever float around the world of no particular importance to anyone except for the money he's got to spend. The European Union, which has bankrupted itself in support of Zelensky and which has committed itself to unending, eternal economic, financial subvention of whatever rump state emerges from these talks or from the outcome on the battlefield, is unable to pay the bills that it is writing checks for. A good example is the so-called doubling of the defense expenditure of every NATO country. Of course, that always looked a tall order. The struggle to get to half that number has caused untold social, political, and economic problems in all Western European countries. But it turns out they've got clever accountants. They are going to spend money on roads and bridges and railways in their own countries and count that as their 5% contribution to the NATO budget. Whether Trump will be happy about that, whether the American taxpayer, who already shoulders 80% of the burden of the expenditure of NATO, and yet seems to have very little control, at least of the rhetoric of NATO leaders, remains to be seen. That rhetoric is reaching fever pitch. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, and in Brussels, the chorus is clear that President Trump has no right to negotiate about Ukraine over the head of the Ukrainian spent government. Well, that's a very strange proposition. If NATO is funded 80% by the United States, and if the Ukrainian military marches on its stomach in boots, uniforms, rifles, and wielding weapons, and being transported in motorized transport with American materiel, who else can negotiate an end to this conflict but Donald Trump? Now, Chebos, who will be on the show later, has already opined speculatively, as he is the first to admit, as to what the Russian demands will be. And I have no reason to second guess him. He's in Moscow. I am not. But I do say this, that for all the blood and treasure and diplomatic disruption and the threats still of the mass confiscation of hundreds of billions of dollars and euros worth of Russia's sovereign wealth being held by thieves who threaten to cash it in, I'm not sure that the gains delineated by Chebos would necessarily have been worth the blood and the bones of all the grenadiers that lay in the ground in Ukraine in order to obtain it. If the final settlement is merely the freezing of the conflict, like the Korean conflict, with a huge demilitarized zone and with a never-ending stream of NATO weapons, and Ruta made plain this very week that NATO will continue to supply weapons to rump Ukraine, whatever is decided, by Trump and Putin this weekend, then that will not have been worth the price that Russia has paid for it. If Odessa, the jewel in the Russian crown of Russian civilization, remains in the hands of the Azov battalion, the Hitlerites and Banderites, the killers of Jews and Slavs and Poles in huge numbers, if that is the outcome, and if the outcome is the continuation of the marooning of the Russian populations in Transnistria, in Moldova, and along the coast, then I myself, if my son had been sacrificed in that war, I myself would not have regarded that as a price worth paying. Of course, the Donbass cannot be underestimated as a prize. These are Russian territories. They were always Russian territories. They were only ever Ukrainian territories as long as Ukraine was a part of the USSR. When the USSR was disbanded, all these Russian territories should have come back to Russia. Crimea being the case in point. Crimea was not given to Ukraine until I was already at primary school, and it was given after a drunken night of toasts by the drunkard Nikita Khrushchev as some kind of fraternal gesture, when Crimea, of course, is of the utmost significance, strategically, militarily, socially, culturally, and in national and ethnic terms to Russia, that it could not possibly have been the intention that it would end up in a foreign country which bore ill will and malice towards the country whose territory it really was. So we'll see about the art of the deal on Friday. In the next couple of minutes, because we've got three guests, great guests, and I want to give them the maximum time. So I'm cutting my own monologue short. In this peculiar game of whack-a-mole, we may very well just see the end of the Ukraine war as a new war in the Levant begins, as a continuation of the previous war in West Asia, in Iran, in the Persian Gulf, begins again. Netanyahu gets full marks from me for honesty. He said in an interview yesterday he dreams of greater Israel, which might have come as a shock to the rulers in Egypt, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, which is where the borders of greater Israel lie, but probably didn't, because they've known it all along. They've just chosen to remain in denial. But the outcome of the Western imposed diktat and ultimatum in the Lebanon may well prove the spark of all-out war in the Middle East. Peace in Ukraine, war in the Middle East. What an advance that would be. It's all coming.
What is the state of affairs on the ground, on the battlefield, as we speak, 2 days before the meeting in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin?
Well, as you know, over the weekend, we had the largest strike to this point in the war launched by Russia against Ukrainian targets all over Ukraine. It was devastating. Now what we've seen over the last couple of days are major breakthroughs. And these breakthroughs are occurring largely because there's not much in front of the Russians anymore. So they're smashing their way through defensive lines that are largely unoccupied, not completely, but in many cases unoccupied. And the interesting thing is to watch the Russians, because they are nothing if not very, very deliberate and methodical. They move on an axis that is large enough to accommodate thousands of troops. It has good transportation, medical support, evacuation support, logistical supplies. But most important, on either side of the axis where they're moving, they have what I would call ISR dominance. That is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance from basically the smallest drone up to satellites. So they're controlling the area as they move forward. They don't have to be concerned about their flanks or the possibility that somebody may attack through them, because all of these ISR systems are linked to artillery systems, rockets, missiles, and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that you have this picture on the one side of Ukrainian forces that are literally bled white, that are falling apart, not for lack of courage or any of that sort of thing. That's nonsense. It's simply impossible for them to mount an effective resistance against the on-rushing Russians. And then on the Russian side, you have this 21st century force, extraordinarily well-equipped, technologically savvy, essentially knocking drones out of the air with either electronic warfare or other means, and moving not at high speed, but fast enough that the opposing force has no chance of recovering. And right now, they keep talking about the so-called Azov formations. I guess there's something like 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 brigades left. I don't know what their strength is. It's probably not much. But these are the sort of diehard Nazis. They seem to be nowhere in the path of the Russians. I think they've beat a path elsewhere. So I'm not sure there's really much in front of the advancing Russian forces. So from a purely military standpoint, I would say this is the end of the war.
Is it fair to say that Russia is close to achieving its military objectives in the war, if those objectives are the acquisition of the 4 oblasts?
Oh, well, that's been achieved. But remember, the key thing for them has always been not so much capturing territory, but annihilating the Ukrainian forces on the ground. That's the problem. So they're very force-oriented in what they do. Now, we may see finally a buildup of forces in various places of 100,000 or more that are large enough and well-supplied enough that they can move deeper. I think you're going to see that in the direction of Zaporizhia. The bridges over the Dnieper are intact. Zaporizhia has real strategic value. If they decide to cross the river, they can go north or south from there, attacking north to Kiev or south to Odessa. I think those are the decisions that they're going to make now in the next couple of weeks. And we're going to see more and more movement. But the point is, the Ukrainian force is almost annihilated. There are still some people left. And they're not going to stop as long as there's anyone from these Azov units around. I would expect the Russians to plow forward. But securing the Russian areas, the Russian-speaking areas, yes. But then the next question is, what are you going to do to secure the outcome of the war? They're going to be victorious militarily. That's not enough. In other words, how do you come to an arrangement with somebody who is competent in the West that brings you the measure of security that you want? All of this has been about protecting Russia. This was never about conquering territory and marching west into Poland or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. That's all nonsense. And I think that's on the back of people's minds right now in Moscow.
Well, that brings us to my next series of questions, which brings us to Friday. I mean, how would you advise, in light of what you've just told us? How I wish you were there, but you're not. How would you advise President Trump? What cards does he have to play when he meets with Vladimir Putin on Friday?
Well, I think first we need to keep in mind, Judge, and we've talked about this before, there is no strategy per se. In other words, when the decision was made back in the 90s, we're going to expand NATO and keep pushing it. And ultimately, we will encircle Russia, and Russia will be compelled to join on our terms. This was the talk in the 90s. That was the talk, by the way, behind closed doors during the Kosovo Air campaign. We're going to go all the way to Moscow. This is going to change everything. But there was no strategy for it. It was kind of a wish list where people sit down and say, well, we really wish that Russia would fall apart. We really wish that Iran could be destroyed. We really wish, this kind of thing, but no strategy, no coherent way to get there. So now what you have is something that we've had for a while. If you brought in the people that were there under Biden, I would go further all the way back to the original Trump administration. The people involved in foreign and defense policy are a lot like monkeys at the opera. You can take a group of monkeys to the opera and the monkeys will sit in the chair and they're fascinated by all the explosions and the sound and the fury on the stage, but the monkeys have no idea what the hell is going on the stage. Well, that's kind of what's in charge right now. And in the center of this mess sits Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a brilliant marketer. He's a very successful advertising genius, I would say. He was a big success as a reality TV show host, but he knows nothing about Russia. He doesn't understand Europe. He doesn't understand where we fit in the world and where we don't. And so I can't imagine under those circumstances anything happening. What I do imagine is that the monkeys in the audience will yell and scream and holler, and there'll be excitement. But the Russians are just going to sit there and sort of shake their heads in disbelief that people like this represent the United States of America, because they're not going to see any evidence that anything we do or say can be trusted. And I think that's the final problem. There's no reason for them to trust us. And if you have no trust, no understanding, how do you get an agreement that's meaningful?
So who has the most to gain and who has the most to lose over this meeting on Friday?
Well, first, we've already lost. Our whole war, pushed by London and New York City and Washington and the billionaire oligarchs that wanted to destroy Russia and get at its resources, they've already lost. And I think, truthfully, most of them are now turning their attention to the Middle East. Oh, they'll continue to reinforce stupidity whenever they get the chance in Ukraine or anywhere in Europe. But I think there's a realization that this is over, that there's not a great deal that they can do. Trump is there because he wants, as we've discussed in the past, to win. In other words, you saw him with Azerbaijan and Armenia, the two leaders from these states who signed this piece of paper that allegedly will become a treaty. Well, there's no guarantee that the respective parliamentary bodies in those countries will approve this or confirm it. There's no evidence that we have the staying power right now as a nation to make any of it real. But that's irrelevant. What President Trump got was the opportunity to sit between them, hold up this document, and smile ear to ear and bill himself as the great peacemaker, deal maker. On the Russian side, it's very different. They know that they're in the driver's seat. They know that they have won. The question is, what do they want? And they know what they want. They don't want a hostile regime in Kiev. They want a government in Kiev that will be fundamentally neutral, divorced from NATO, and pose no threat to Russia. That's what they want. They're trying to figure out, how do we get there when there's no one in the West, particularly no one from this administration, who's really capable of delivering that? That's the problem. So they'll sit, they'll be polite, and there may be some discussions on the side, I think, about nuclear weapons. There may be an effort on our part, I hope, to suggest that we reconvene and go back to the INF Treaty and look at what we can do to salvage some of the things in there and sort of reduce the nuclear danger, get these nuclear weapons that were just flown into England out. I think those kinds of things could be discussed. Somebody said something about the Arctic, but The problem is, if you're going to try and achieve anything in the Arctic, you've got to get everybody who has Arctic coastline to a conference. And I'm sure that's what President Putin would say. We're comfortable with where we are in the Arctic right now. But if you want to change something or you want to codify something, you've got to bring everybody in. You know, in other words, what the Russians are is methodical. They're methodical. They've prepared. These are professional diplomats and soldiers. They know what it takes to arrive at a real serious agreement. They see no evidence for that whatsoever in the American camp. There has never been anything like that now for at least 2 decades.
Before we, or as we transition into what I want to discuss with you about whether or not the Israelis and Americans are contemplating another war against Iran, is there any country in the world besides Israel that uses its military deliberately to target, hunt down, and murder journalists?
Well, you're asking the wrong guy. That's an area about which I know very little. I don't know. There could be, but certainly the Israelis win first prize at this point.
2 months ago, President Trump embraced the ISIS leader that he refers to as the president of Syria, notwithstanding there's no democratic process there, and notwithstanding the horrific background of this person, Mr. Al-Jilani. Yesterday, Al-Jilani asked the Russians to help him resist the imperialistic tendencies of the Israeli military. Where is this going?
Well, it is very odd. I mean, after all, this is the man that President Trump embraced, said was a fine fellow and a very smart man and all this kind of nonsense, who's obviously a criminal and a mass murderer. He now wants protection from the mass murderers that are attacking southern Syria. He's ostensibly turned to the Russians. The Russians are interested in that strip of territory that is controlled right now by their forces and the Alawites, the people that were dislodged from power in Damascus. And that's on the Syrian coast, the Mediterranean coast. They're interested in that. That's what they want to retain. I don't think the Russians are particularly interested in patrolling in support of Jolani and others like him in any sort of conflict against the Israelis. That doesn't mean they love the Israelis. It doesn't mean they're the enemies of the Israelis. I'm just not sure that's something that the Russians would want to become involved in. But it is kind of a slap in our face, because we did everything we could to put this man into power in support of the Mossad and MI6 in London. Now, all of a sudden, our biggest ally, our greatest ally, is interested in absorbing as much of Syria as possible through the Druze and the Kurds, and he's calling for help and assistance. It's a very strange set of circumstances. I don't see us doing a lot, and I don't see the Russians intervening down there.
Has Netanyahu been saber rattling about attacking Iran? And if he is, would he do so without the tacit approval of President Trump?
I think whatever Netanyahu does will be immediately approved by President Trump. I think the notion that President Trump is a free agent who is looking after, first and foremost, America's national security interests is simply delusional. I think Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. I've said that now for a long time. I still think he is. And whatever he wants, he's going to get. We have to understand that Mr. Netanyahu can do what he does because there is a small group, a minority of people with a great deal of money in Washington, D.C., New York City, and London, the bankers, the banking system, the financial elites that control everything that President Trump wants to do in foreign policy. Now, he has leverage domestically, but I don't think he has a lot of leverage. So whether or not President Netanyahu or Prime Minister Netanyahu gets on the phone and says, look, I'm going to launch this attack, I just wanted to let you know, and here's your warning, it's going to happen soon. Whether or not he does that probably is irrelevant. he's going to be able to do pretty much what he wants right now. And that will continue as long as he and the people that back him, and I'm talking about Mr. Netanyahu as well as Mr. Trump, control the Congress and control the White House. You know, this is a group of people that surround President Trump who are, I would say, 200% Israel firsters.
I realize that for all of your education, you're graduate from West Point, a PhD in military history, and all your years.
Actually, I'm not a PhD in history, so I'm glad you brought that up because I'm sick of people saying that. I have a doctoral dissertation was in international relations, and my master's was comparative politics. But when people say, "What did you study?" I always say the same thing.
All right, that's
Germans and Russians.
All right, Colonel, that's even better for my question. You're not a lawyer, but you understand these things. Is Donald Trump culpable for war crimes in Gaza?
I think, strictly speaking, yes, our government is culpable. He's at the head of it. Does he really understand that? Does he grasp it? That's a different question entirely. And if you put him in the dock and you started interrogating him and asking him questions, as any good attorney would do, I think people would be shocked at what he doesn't know, because I'm not convinced that he has a fundamental grasp on any of it. And again, from his vantage point, his attitude may be, well, I can't do anything about this. I can't make any decisions that would cross the Israeli lobby and obviously Mr. Netanyahu. So why should I worry a great deal about it? And I think he's actually begun in his own way to try and turn away from things that he can't control. You know, for instance, in Ukraine, one of the things that could happen as a result of this meeting that occurs in Alaska is that he walks out and says, you know, we had a great discussion. We agreed on many things, but clearly we're not ready for an agreement yet. And there's not a great deal that I can do about this situation because my European allies, Mr. Zelensky, wants something very different. Mr. Putin has done what he can do, but he still wants something very different. And so it's time for me to turn my attentions elsewhere. I mean, that's not impossible. Now, some people will say he can't do that. Well, in reality, the government that he has right now is already on autopilot. In other words, the foreign and defense establishments, they're really on autopilot. We're back to where we were during the first term. It doesn't make a great deal of difference what he may say or do. They're going to do what they're going to do anyway. So he may say, I'm washing my hands of this, but in truth, we're going to continue to do the same old thing. When you get to the Middle East, it's different. That's a much stickier issue for him. He has to be involved in that, and he is. How do you explain his willingness to embrace Jolani, knowing that Jolani is murdering thousands of people on a routine basis? How do you embrace Erdogan, who is a big backer of all of this? How do you embrace the people in Azerbaijan, this Aliyev regime? You know that this thing with Armenia has very little staying power. I don't see anything really good coming out of this. This is all about encircling Russia, splitting Russia from Iran. It's all the same strategy, but he's on that ride. He's strapped in. He's on the roller coaster. He can't get off. That's different. But I think in Eastern Europe, he's probably predisposed to say, look, I've done all I can do. I can't do anything else.
It's interesting you say that, because yesterday it appeared to be an offhanded comment, but it has some legs, as we say in the media today. Vice President Vance said, we're finished funding the Ukrainians. Now, I don't know if it was a comment that he made without thinking about it, if he ran it past the president first, if this is the way they want to set the table for Alaska. I don't know. At the present time, we are continuing, as I understand it, you may correct me if I'm wrong, to supply them with the military equipment at the same pace and levels we did under Joe Biden and had been in the past 8 months, and that the Vance statement was an outlier. What do you think?
Well, you say at the same pace. I don't think that's possible because we simply don't have the ammunition, the missiles, the rockets, and so forth, the equipment to send. So I wouldn't say at the same pace. The promises are there. You're still talking about billions of dollars of equipment that people are promising the Ukrainians. And I think there's an increasing awareness that this stuff will never arrive because the Ukrainian government and this Ukrainian state itself will collapse long before that. I mean, that's the reality. That's why I'm saying it may not make any difference to Donald Trump what J.D. Vance says publicly about anything. He may take the view of, well, let's make virtue of necessity instead of allowing people to know that we have failed. He's tried routinely to blame Biden for everything, but he's taken ownership and is very much part of it now. So instead of saying we failed, the war is over and we've lost, we'll just say, well, we're finished with this. We're not going to do that anymore. It's all meaningless. It doesn't matter. None of these people are telling the truth. Everything is for shock and awe, political shock and awe. And remember, the base that's sitting out there that voted for him, they're waiting for evidence that he's going to do any of the things that he said. And that's the problem for him in foreign and defense policy. He can't. He just doesn't have the maneuver room. So fine, let J.D. Vance say anything he wants. And I don't think anybody's going to pay much attention to it.
All right, let's look at the flip side of what Vance said and of the, as you point out, decreasing pace at which we're sending military gear there. Are we dangerously low ourselves, Colonel?
Oh, absolutely. And I think to some extent you had Colonel Astor who came on. I don't know if he pronounces his name Astor or Astori.
I think it's Astor. He was brilliant and terrific, and he's a big fan of yours.
Yeah, well, he's right. And everything he said is spot on. He's not the only one. I mean, I talk to people all the time that are on the inside that just are worried sick that we'll push ourselves into a confrontation with the Russians or the Chinese or Iranians or somebody without understanding that, after 3 or 4 days, you're out of ammo. What are you going to use in response? There's also a greater sensitivity to the recognition that the situation inside Iran has changed. The air defenses are far, far more rigorous and integrated now than they were previously. The Russians have been in there working very hard to help the Iranians so that if Mr. Netanyahu does launch another attack, which I think is inevitable, I really do. I think it'll happen probably in September, but it could happen earlier. Whenever Mr. Netanyahu gives a speech and he addresses the Iranian people and he tells them, we love you, we're your friends, just overthrow this heinous regime, another attack is coming any day.
Yeah.
So I think
and he gave a speech like that just 2 days ago.
Right, exactly. So I think that's coming. It doesn't matter what we want or anything else because Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. So that's going to happen. And I think Astori is absolutely correct in everything that he said. And yes, we are dangerously low. And again, this is something that people that I know in the defense industry have talked about for years, and nobody ever pays attention to it, Judge. Where is our surge capacity? What is impressive about the Russian arsenal of military power has been, it's not a question of simply ramping up assembly lines and manufacturing capability. It's the ability to ramp up quickly and dramatically, decisively, so that instead of producing 600 widgets every week, you produce 2,000. Well, we're still producing 600 a year. And we should have, if we were serious about any of this, gone to something in the neighborhood of about 6,000 a year. But we haven't. And as long as we persist in the illusion that we are this great, invincible, invulnerable, unchallengeable superpower, but at the same time do nothing to support that myth, we're going to be embarrassed at some point. It's coming. It's inevitable. The emperor in Washington doesn't have very much clothing, Judge.
Colonel McGregor, thank you very much, my dear friend. Thank you for letting me flip-flop across the board on these various hotspots. I will see you Saturday.
Right.
And I very much look forward to it, where you, Professor Sachs, Anya Parampil, and her less attractive half, Max Blumenthal.
Hey, listen, Max is a hero. Come on.
Yes, Max is a hero, and I love to bust his chops. The four of you will be on a panel, and I will be questioning you. Unfortunately, we have 25 minutes for the four of you, as opposed to 25 minutes for each of you. But I will do my best to keep the conversation going. The audience will love it, and it will be live streamed right here.
Good.
Thank you, Colonel. See you Saturday. Safe travels. All the best.
Same to you. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. And coming up at 1:30 this afternoon, the aforementioned target of my lovable barbs, Max Blumenthal, at 2 o'clock, Pepe Escobar at 3 o'clock from antiwar.com, good friend of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.
Thank you for that. Well, the Trump administration just placed a $5 million bounty on the head of Haitian leader Jimmy Cherizier, aka Barbecue. Of course, look out how the mainstream media labels him. By the way, here's the Fox News piece. Feds unseal charges against Barbecue, Haitian gang leader, with $5 million bounty on his head. Haitian gang leader, they label him. Without maybe any knowledge or understanding of who he is and who he's actually been fighting against. Maybe the puppet government there, but we'll talk about that. More on that part in a minute. Here's the indictment. A U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro on Tuesday announced an indictment in Washington, D.C., accusing Jimmy Barbecue Cherizier and Bazile Richardson, a naturalized U.S. citizen, of conspiring to send U.S. funds to finance Cherizier's Haitian group, what they call a gang. The Department of Justice said Cherizier is a fugitive and is believed to be in Haiti. Well, someone who knows Jimmy Cherizier well, he's interviewed him multiple times, spent a lot of time in Haiti covering this story, more than just about anyone else in the world, by the way. One of the best independent journalists in the world is Dan Cohen from Uncaptured Media, and Dan is here to help us understand this indictment. Dan, good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Always good to be with you. And I mean, I gotta say, some of the work I did and the trips to Haiti I did were for your show, were for Redacted. So all respect to you all for being part of that.
Well, you were, pretty much a lone voice in actually covering the truth there. So when I see these headlines like on Fox News or the Associated Press or others calling, really, I think mislabeling Jimmy Cherizier as a gang leader. But I just want to get your take on this indictment. Were you surprised that the Trump administration would sort of almost pull a Biden and go after him in this way?
I mean, I've been arguing really since the Biden era, early in the Biden era, that it would be more likely to see a major escalation under a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, because the Biden administration had to pretend to be like woke and like it cared about diversity and these kinds of things. So like having Karine Jean-Pierre, who's Haitian American, like lowered over or be the
More on that part in a minute. Here's the indictment. A U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro on Tuesday announced an indictment in Washington, D.C., accusing Jimmy Barbecue Cherizier and Bazile Richardson, a naturalized U.S. citizen, of conspiring to send U.S. funds to finance Cherizier's Haitian group, what they call a gang. The Department of Justice said Cherizier is a fugitive and is believed to be in Haiti. Well, someone who knows Jimmy Cherizier well, he's interviewed him multiple times, spent a lot of time in Haiti covering this story, more than just about anyone else in the world, by the way. One of the best independent journalists in the world is Dan Cohen from Uncaptured Media. And Dan is here to help us understand this indictment. Dan, good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Always good to be with you. And I mean, I gotta say, some of the work I did and the trips to Haiti I did were for your show, were for Redacted. So all respect to you all for being part of that.
Well, you were, pretty much a lone voice in actually covering the truth there. So when I see these headlines like on Fox News or the Associated Press or others calling, really, I think mislabeling Jimmy Cherizier as a gang leader. But I just want to get your take on this indictment. Were you surprised that the Trump administration would sort of almost pull a Biden and go after him in this way?
I mean, I've been arguing really since the Biden era, early in the Biden era, that it would be more likely to see a major escalation under a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, because the Biden administration had to pretend to be like woke and, like it cared about diversity and these kinds of things. So like having Karine Jean-Pierre, who's Haitian American, like lowered over or be the White House press secretary for sending some kind of invasionary force into her country of origin would not look so good. And it's much easier to say to, parts of, at least, I mean, not the MAGA crowd, to say, look, we're going after this crazy black gang leader who's a cannibal. And, and that was what was being said about Cherizier last year all over X, and Elon Musk was promoting that, and all of the kind of pro-Trump influencers at that time. So I'm not surprised. It's a bipartisan effort. Democrats, Republicans have been pushing this, as you said, back to the Clinton years. And, it's a long history of U.S. Interference in Haitian affairs.
Can I pull up this page 2 of this indictment? Sorry, I just want to read it. I think we should talk about it. So page 2 of the indictment, Cherizier is a Haitian national residing in Haiti who formerly served as an officer in the Haitian National Police. He founded the revolutionary forces of the G9 family and allies. And in June of 2020, he tried to unite the 9 gangs in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He remains its current leader. In September 2023, Cherizier helped found the gang alliance Vivre Ensemble, which he still leads as of this date of this indictment, to unite Haiti's many criminal gangs in an alliance to oppose the legitimate government of Haiti. So I just sort of laughed out loud at that when I saw that in the indictment, and I couldn't help but laugh. Here I'm reading an indictment, and it says the legitimate government of Haiti. Can you explain to our audience why that's laughable?
Well, that last clause, the legitimate government in Haiti, is, I mean, when you said that line out loud, I just smirked, just like you. There is no legitimate government. There's no elected government in Haiti. The Haitian people themselves have no say in this government. Not one person voted for this government. It is a government appointed by the United States and its proxies. So it's only legitimate in the eyes of Washington, but it's not Haitian in any sense. I mean, the last elected president of Haiti got a bullet. He got murdered. He got a bullet to his head, and if you notice, there's no appetite for figuring out who murdered President Jovenel Moïse in July 7th, 2021, I believe was the date. And imagine if Putin did that. We would never hear the end of, Putin had this guy assassinated in this country to put in some puppet regime. But that's exactly what happened, and U.S. fingerprints are all over that. And actually, the most prominent person who has been demanding justice for Jovenel is Jimmy Cherizier. So that kind of says a lot. But it's a totally absurd, just a massive lie to call the regime in Haiti a legitimate government.
But the Biden administration did make some rumblings about invading Haiti, about military force in Haiti, and they never actually did it. And so do you think that this is a precursor that the Trump administration may in fact do it?
It looks like it. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but certainly it's an escalation. The thing that I take away from this is it kind of reeks of desperation. I mean, they're talking about Jimmy Cherizier as some kind of big gang leader who, must have powerful connections to the outside world. If he doesn't have any popular support, if he really is some criminal warlord, like they say, he would be getting large amounts of money from some foreign countries, some foreign oligarchs, something. But all they could come up with in this indictment, if you read through it, is transfers of $25, $50, $100. Some of them are one or two, or there's one for like $4,000 that are not even sent to Cherizier, but are sent to an unnamed Haitian, supposedly for the benefit of Cherizier. So maybe there's like several $1,000s here. most of it in small increments, and it's through one, allegedly, according to the indictment, which again, this is just an indictment. There's no actual evidence presented here. This is not a conviction in a court of law. An indictment, is not very hard to come up with, especially when there's a political agenda behind it. But this is all on one guy, named Basil Richardson, who's a Haitian American truck driver. Like that this reeks of a bigger agenda behind it to me. Of they're looking for anything to try to nail this guy, and maybe whatever network of support he does have in the Haitian diaspora, which there are many Haitians in the U.S., in Canada, in France, around countries where they're living, that do support barbecue because they've seen, hey, this guy is trying to stabilize the country, the exact opposite of what the U.S. and the core group, what Canada and France and these foreign powers have done to our country for years, which is force people to flee in the first place. So I don't know what, I mean, we do know that a month ago or so, it came out that the Trump administration has hired Blackwater under its new name, but Eric Prince, to send some mercenaries into Haiti to take out barbecue and take out, the leaders of this group Vive Ensemble. So there's definitely movement. Where it goes could be is anybody's guess, but I would not be surprised by some kind of escalation from the U.S. At this point.
So, ladies and gentlemen, our bodies are under attack, and not just from the air we breathe or the food we eat. We're being exposed to mRNA technology injected into our food supplies, spread even a free bottle of vitamin D3 with your order. Call deal yet. Detox your body, rebuild your gut, take your health into your own hands starting today. What about intelligence? A lot of people in our chat room are asking about the CIA, funneling money or trying to, try to entrap him or do something like that. I mean, the CIA is maybe the largest criminal organization in the world, led by Satan, led by demons, for crying out loud. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them being in some involvement here in Haiti. What do you make of maybe intelligence, operatives there in your, I mean, I don't know when's the last time you spoke to Jimmy Cherizier. You've interviewed him, you talked to him. Do they think like U.S. intelligence is actively involved in Haiti somewhere in Port-au-Prince or otherwise?
I mean, I haven't directly communicated with Cherizier in, I would say, a year or so. My colleagues at Haiti Liberté, who are constantly on the Haiti beat, communicate with him more frequently. And I'm not anywhere near a fluent Creole speaker, so that's really the Haiti Liberté guys. Kim Ives, of course, who I went down there, who speaks with him more on a journalistic basis. But I mean, in terms of intelligence, I have no doubt that intelligence, assets, informants, whatever, are all over the place. I mean, of course. I mean, the main one, that I look at who's doing the U.S.'s dirty work is more sitting out in the open. We're talking about a guy named Pierre Esperance. If you watch Jeanine Pirro's press conference, she referenced not only the violation of sanctions, but also she talked about what is referred to as the La Saline massacre. And she said Cherizier killed 70 or 71 people in Haiti back in 2018. And this is like the Syrian Duma, faked chemical weapons attack. It's like Iraqi WMD kind of thing where Cam Ives and I are the only people that actually investigated. We're the only journalists to investigate this supposed La Saline massacre. And actually what it was a gun battle between two armed groups. And Cherizier was not directly involved in any way. And according to the U.S. government-funded and open society-funded human rights groups, that they came up with this narrative. They crafted a narrative basically for the U.S. that Cherizier was the author of this heinous massacre against innocent civilians. And this has become the main charge that you hear again and again and again. In every New York Times and Washington Post article, and now in this indictment, it's the La Saline massacre. But if you actually take the time to examine all of the reports, there are like 7 different reports, NGO reports on this. It's not what it is. We interviewed people on the ground. We interviewed people, who were around there. And there's just not a shred of evidence that this was actually a massacre. And so this guy, Pierre Esperance, he is the head of the primary NGO. He's a very well-known guy in Haiti, and he travels to Washington frequently. He's the guy who I would say is more of like, an asset of the U.S. Embassy. And there are a few like him. So that's what I would look to.
Dan Cohen, and by the way, if people want to dive deeper into this, you've done incredible documentary work on this. Where can people go to learn more about Haiti if they want to educate themselves on this?
Firstly, I definitely recommend checking out Haiti Liberté, and they have a new article that examines the claims in the indictment, the work of Kim Ives and Bethany Dupont, and support them. They're a small channel that works very hard, is very dedicated. I co-directed a 3-part documentary on Haiti, where we thoroughly examine the claims not only of the La Saline massacre and other claims against him, but we examine Cherizier's rise from his transformation from cop, he was a police officer, to #1 target of the U.S. And that series is called Another Vision Inside Haiti's Uprising. You can watch that for free on my Uncaptured Media YouTube channel. And I also highly recommend watching the lengthy report, which is, we call it Another Vision Episode 4, that we did for Redacted back in 2022, which I think is called like Special Report U.S. Invasion of Haiti, something like that. And then we actually did another piece on the creation of Vivre Ensemble, the rise of Vivre Ensemble, when Cherizier was able to unite these rival armed groups to take on the oligarchy. We did that on Uncaptured Media as well. So that's on my YouTube channel. So you can find it all there. And I think if you actually just go to uncaptured.media, that'll take you to
Colombia and a member of Black Alliance for Peace. Jemima, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you and break down a lot of what's happening. And people may or may not have seen in this, so-called transitional government, a new president has assumed the rotating presidency. And the U.S. was actually tweeting recently that anyone who tries to do anything to disrupt this presidency will be held accountable in some sort of, ominous way by the United States. So just another direct intervention in the affairs of Haiti. I mean, give us a sense of what's happening here, because there's so many players and so many different sort of moving pieces here, but it does seem like in general, this is just another example that the government in Haiti is to some degree an extension of the US and other regional powers.
Right. Thank you so much for talking about Haiti, because people have seem to have forgotten what's going on, except for every once in a while when the New York Times throws in a story without any context, as if what's happening in Haiti is always violence and violence is endemic to these Haitians, and as if the imperialists don't have anything to do with it. What's going on in Haiti is actually just another saga in ongoing occupation. And this occupation, of course, as I always say, began in 2004 with the US, France, Canada led coup d'etat against Haiti's democratically elected government. This occupation, of course, was consecrated by the UN with a Chapter 7 military force and occupation of Haiti, which happened, which lasted from 2004 to 2017. And there's the UN office, this acronym is BNU, that's still in Haiti. And there's a core group that still runs Haiti. So everything that's happening, whatever violence you see, everything is under UN occupation. There's been an assassination of the president. There's been a removal of a prime minister, and then you have the core group designating who's going to be Haiti's prime minister. When he was removed after a lot of protests and so on, the U.S. with its proxies in the Caribbean, the CARICOM community, especially Mia Mottley and Irfan Ali, which is the prime minister of Barbados and Guyana, prime ministers of Barbados and Guyana, respectively, worked together with Anthony Blinken in a hotel room in Jamaica, and basically created the Haitian government, which is a 9-person presidential council with a rotating presidency. And I think every few months you get a new president. And so what we have is a complete colonial control of Haiti, which has been under occupation. So whatever happens is under the auspices of the US, the UN. And also during this time, 2 years ago, you had the multi-security, the MSS, the security mission, where the US brought in Kenyan mercenaries who are still in Haiti at this point, under a contract paid for primarily by the US, even though people say it's a UN mission. It's not a UN mission. It's not under a UN purview. And so these people they're riding around Haiti. There's no accountability for whatever actions that they do in Haiti. So we're in a situation we're in a colonial occupation, a colonial situation, and so that's what's happening right now. So this new presidency is part of this 9-person council, but then you also have the rise in violence, and then of course I'm sure everyone's talking about the New York Crimes article on Wesley Clark's mercenary group. And the missing mercenaries that were sent to Haiti in the fall, and then of course there's Eric Prince, the OG of mercenaries, especially with his work with Blackwater, and then later on, and all the drama and all the trauma he caused in Iraq and West Asia, and so that's what's happening in Haiti. Haiti is really undergoing really terrible trauma, but all stems from the original moment of this coup d'etat, and then the complete control and the complete destruction of the Haitian state, the legislature, the courts, the government, the police. And then, so this was by design so that you can come back, and now when there's violence, because there's I forgot, what's the word? There's no state. And so then when there's violence, there's no real state to control what's going on. There's a vacuum, a power vacuum. You can come in, as the New York Crimes does, and say, well, this violence has been going on for a long time, and we don't know what's going on with Haiti, and what do we need to do about Haiti?
So I want to, I want to ask you, just to lay out, and I know I always ask you this when we have you on to talk about Haiti, but I think it's important to routinely establish this because Haiti isn't discussed enough. What is it that the U.S. wants out of Haiti? Why so many coups and the collapse of, and the intentional collapsing of the state and its institutions and legislature, and the constant interventions under the cover of peacekeeping and humanitarianism? What is it that that U.S. imperialism gets out of Haiti?
That's a very good question. The U.S. has been, first of all, there's the Haitian Revolution. So let's, and I think it's important to talk about this. Since 1804, where these enslaved Africans basically defeated France and the Western world and became independent. Haiti's the second independent country, but the first free country in the Western Hemisphere. And so there's been a backlash against that. Yeah, the white Western world never forgets, and they don't forgive their loss of power, and they'll do whatever. So you have that, and so you have all the media representations of Haiti. All of that comes from that revolution. But the other thing is Haiti has also fought back, just in terms of not allowing complete capture. I think this is the most successful the U.S. has come to completely capturing the Haitian state. We're surrounded by neo-colonial countries, except for Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. All of these other states in the region are I'm talking about the Caribbean in particular, not necessarily places like Colombia fully and so on, but I'm thinking about like Jamaica, Barbados, and all these places. They are neo-colonial spaces, and Haiti has never been able. They've never been able to completely capture the country in the way that they have, where you have a pliant state, and which is why they went about completely dismantling our state and removing our democratically elected government. The other part also is Haiti is in the Windward Passage. And so it's really well located. The U.S. has always wanted this area in northwest part of Haiti called Mole Saint Nicolas, which is like a peninsula part. And if you look at the map in between Haiti and Cuba, you have this route that takes you straight to the Panama Canal, because the U.S. really wants to control that area as it prepares to go to war with China. And so it needs that area geopolitically. Haiti is a country of 12 to 13 million people. You need the cheap labor. You want to remove people from their land, which is why, despite everything that's going on, this puppet government is pushing through a referendum to change the Haitian constitution. And that's being pushed by the U.S. government and these neocons in power. And so geopolitically, Haiti is important for the U.S. because of its location. Economically, they need the cheap labor as they lose labor from Asia and so on. But also historically, Haiti has always been a thorn on the side of the white West.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned this issue of a vacuum for power, because I feel like, yeah, as you said, like people always are sort of presenting this in the U.S. media, like, oh, these Haitians are just so violent and they're just killing each other. But it seems to me we have sort of like a multi-sided issue when you look at both what seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of an intra-elite struggle. But then you also, of course, have people trying to defend their own communities against violence that's happening. And then you have this imposed violence of the drone war from these mercenaries as part of the neo-colonial government, and other mercenaries being brought in and other things like that. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like senseless violence to me. I mean, it seems like an extension of this power struggle over whether Haiti's going to be sovereign or not.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to say, despite whatever's happening in Haiti, the first and only solution that the West always has for Haiti is violence. Right? It's always, let's send a military force. Let's send Kenyan mercenaries. Let's send, Wesley Clark and his Studebaker group. And signing contracts, Eric Prince in particular, signing contracts with an illegitimate state, an illegitimate government. This goes completely against international law. It goes against Haitian law, the Haitian Constitution. And so you're absolutely right. There's this vacuum that's open, but that's by design. And let's also talk about the arms that are coming in. With Eric Prince, the mercenary, whose sister was Trump's education secretary. People remember Betsy DeVos or something. Mm-hmm. And the only reason he can get this contract is because he's tied to the Trump government. These contracts don't just happen like that. But he's basically, he was saying all we need is 2,000 people to come into Haiti and take care of this issue. And he wants to basically take control. Remember, it was the same Eric Prince last year that said that U.S. imperialism needs to be more bold, and Africa needs to be occupied, the Latin America needs to be occupied, and so on and so forth. And so Eric Prince is basically shipping tons of, high-grade military weapons to Haiti. There's this major drone warfare. And so every time the UN, for example, which is responsible for Haiti's predicament, they'll say, well, in the past 3 months, 3,000 people have been killed. But what they don't tell you is that, 60 to 70% of these killings come from these drone attacks that, impact civilians, from the police who don't care, and anyone gets in, they're considered collateral damage. And so, yes. And so what's happening is like this nonstop violence response to a problem that actually is a problem of politics and economics and colonialism. And I think it's important to always point that out, because these stories make, they'll say Haiti has been in a spiral of violence since the assassination of the Haitian president in 2021. But before 2021, the U.S. was supporting this president in removing fuel subsidies for the people. His election is illegitimate because the Organization of American States was involved in faking his election and changing the numbers and so on and so forth. The person before him, the election results were changed by Hillary Clinton. So let's really be clear that this is a violent response to what's been happening. That's a continuation of the violence response to Haiti. And we have to actually always remember that, because what they're going to do, they're going to keep, what we see what's happening in Gaza, what's being allowed to happen in Gaza, that's going to be what's going to be allowed to happen in other places. And we have to be very clear about that, because we're just collateral damage. You can just send some mercenary into Haiti with some drones and he'll just kill a bunch of kids and nobody cares. And nobody's held accountable. And that's the problem we have. And we need to actually call the U.S. and the United Nations in particular into account for the problems that they've caused for Haiti.
I want to ask you, what about people in Haiti? I mean, they're never really mentioned as, except in the context of we have to go save them, and that's why Eric Prince is sending drones. But I imagine, people in Haiti have opinions on this. I imagine there's some sort of movements in Haiti that are pushing against U.S. imperial aggression. And of course, what can people in the U.S. do when it comes to U.S. intervention in Haiti?
Well, what people need to do is to tell their government to really stop this, and this nonstop intervention. They're the ones selling. They're the ones. The equipment, the military equipment that's coming to Haiti is coming primarily from the U.S. Right, and it's not equipment to help, for example, the Haitian police. It's equipment, that gets taken at the ports and so on. And so we really need people to deal with that. What's happening in Haiti is you do have a lot of people who think, people are so desperate because the armed groups have wreaked so much havoc in the popular neighborhoods, have pushed the displacement of so many people to the countryside, because a vast majority of the capital city, Port-au-Prince, has been overrun by armed groups, which keep getting stronger because they're recruiting young people. There are no jobs, there are hardly any jobs. There's no security. And so people are afraid, and some people are saying, well, we'll take anything. But I do think that's purposeful, right? You create the conditions for people to actually beg for oppressors to come and save them. But local groups are against this. They know that the imperialists are behind this. There are a lot of local groups around, but they're also being marginalized. These same local groups were against the armed groups. Remember, these armed groups were armed originally by the elite in the country, to go take care of their enemies, or to go by the elite and by the former presidents, right? To squash dissent and so on. And so now these armed groups have gotten out of control. The local people, there are two responses. One of them is we need all the help we can get. But the other response is we need the U.S. to stop manipulating what's happening in Haiti. And we need a different kind of solution. We actually need more conversation, to be honest, without the U.S. pushing certain things. And I also have to say, the U.S. is going, Trump and his racist ICE, machine, deporting people left and right. So on the one hand, they're stopping Haitians from coming in. Haiti is one of the many countries that the U.S. has basically stopped from coming, banned from coming into the country. But they're deporting Haitians, and then they're saying Haitian is a security risk for the U.S. And what people in the U.S. need to understand is that the U.S. is the reason that there's a security risk in Haiti, and we need to really keep holding, these politicians and the U.S. government accountable. No story about Haiti should be written without always pointing out that what's happening in Haiti is a result of the French, U.S., Canada coup d'etat and the continued U.S. control and destruction of the Haitian state.
Absolutely.
Coffee. Follow me.